The sun hadn't yet crested the eastern hills when the screaming began. It started as a distant wail, barely audible over the morning wind that swept across the Lusitanian plains. Then another voice joined it, and another. Within moments, the peaceful dawn shattered into a symphony of terror that echoed through the valley like a death knell. In the village of Corvina, nestled against the rocky foothills where civilization met wilderness, people stumbled from their homes into streets still shadowed by pre-dawn darkness. Mothers clutched children to their chests. Old men grabbed whatever tools they could find, hoes, axes, walking sticks, knowing full well how useless they would be. Because everyone in Corvina knew that sound. Rome had come calling again. Rian Calder burst through the door of his family's modest stone house, his younger sister Marin right behind him. At 19, Ryan had the lean, hardened build of someone who'd worked the land his entire life, but his eyes held something else. A burning intensity that his father often warned would get him killed one day. "Stay inside," he commanded Marin, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Rian, don't," she started, but he was already running toward the village center, where smoke was beginning to rise in dark columns against the lightening sky. The scene that greeted him was chaos incarnate. Roman soldiers in their distinctive segmented armor moved through the streets like a plague of locusts, torches in hand, kicking in doors and dragging people into the open. There were perhaps 30 of them, a standard patrol unit, led by a centurion whose scarlet cloak billowed behind him like a banner of blood. But it wasn't looting they were after. Not this time. "All women between 15 and 25, present yourselves," the centurion bellowed in heavily accented Lusitanian, his voice carrying the absolute authority of Rome. "By order of Governor Aurelius Maximus, you are to be registered for imperial service." Imperial service. The words were bureaucratic, sterile. They meant something far darker. Rian's blood turned to ice as he watched soldiers systematically searching homes, pulling young women into the street. Some went quietly, too terrified to resist. Others fought, screaming and clawing, only to be struck down or subdued. Parents who tried to intervene were beaten with casual brutality. "This is an outrage!" Old Marcus, the village elder, stepped forward with all the dignity his 70 years could muster. "These are free people, citizens of Lusitania under treaty with—" The centurion's fist caught him across the jaw, sending the old man sprawling into the dirt. "Lusitania is a province of Rome," the centurion said coldly, wiping his knuckles. "You are subjects, not citizens, and subjects do not question orders." He turned to his men. "Continue the search. Anyone who interferes will be executed for assaulting Roman soldiers." It was a threat they'd carried out before. Rian's hands clenched into fists so tight his nails drew blood from his palms. Around him, other young men stood frozen, caught between the primal urge to fight and the certain knowledge that resistance meant death. Not just for them, but for everyone they loved. Rome had perfected that calculation centuries ago. Rian Calder? He turned to find his closest friend, Declan, at his side. Declan was built like an ox, with hands that could bend horseshoes, but his eyes were filled with the same helpless rage that Rian felt burning in his own chest. "We can't just watch this," Declan whispered, his voice shaking. "What would you have us do?" Rian shot back, though the words tasted like poison. "Throw ourselves at their swords, die, and leave our families with no one? There are more of us than them. And they're trained killers with armor and weapons while we have farming tools and desperation." Rian forced himself to speak the brutal truth. "We'd be slaughtered in minutes." Even as he said it, he hated himself for the cowardice it represented. The systematic roundup continued. Rian watched in mounting horror as the soldiers herded a group of young women toward 2 large wooden wagons at the edge of the village. Among them was Sarah, the blacksmith's daughter; Elena, who'd just been betrothed last month; Lisa, who was only 16 and still wore her hair in braids like a child. And then he saw Marin being dragged from their house by 2 soldiers. Everything else ceased to exist. "No!" The roar that tore from Rian's throat was animalistic, stripped of all higher reasoning. He lunged forward, covering the distance in seconds, his hands reaching for the nearest soldier's throat. He almost made it. A gladius pommel slammed into his temple, sending him crashing to the ground. The world spun, colors bleeding together, but through the haze he could see Marin struggling, calling his name, tears streaming down her face. "Rian, please," she screamed. "Don't! They'll kill you!" A boot pressed down on his neck, grinding his face into the dirt. Above him, a soldier laughed. "Spirited one," the Roman said in Latin to his companion. "Shall we gut him now or later?" "Later," the other replied. "Let him watch first. Makes the lesson stick better." The pressure on Rian's neck increased until black spots danced across his vision. Through it all, he could hear Marin's sobs growing fainter as they dragged her away. He'd failed her, failed all of them. The thought was worse than dying. Then, cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk, a voice spoke. "I'd let him go if I were you." The boot on Ryan's neck lifted slightly. Through his blurred vision, he could make out a figure standing at the edge of the village square. A tall man in a dark traveling cloak, his face shadowed by the hood. The soldiers turned to face this interruption, hands moving to their weapons with practiced ease. "This doesn't concern you, traveler," the centurion called out, his tone a warning. "Move along before you find yourself part of the lesson." The stranger didn't move, didn't even seem to acknowledge the threat. "Funny thing about lessons," the man said, his voice carrying a strange calm that made the hair on Ryan's neck stand up. "Sometimes the teacher learns more than the student." He stepped forward into the firelight, and for the first time Ryan got a clear look at him. The stranger appeared to be in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of a hard life lived under harsh suns. Dark hair, shot through with premature gray at the temples. Several days of stubble on a strong jaw. But it was his eyes that arrested attention, gray as storm clouds, and holding depths that seemed to have witnessed things no man should see. There was something else, too. Something in the way he moved, with an economy of motion that suggested violence held in careful check. Rian had seen men who could fight. This man looked like fighting was as natural to him as breathing. "Last warning," the centurion said, though a note of uncertainty had crept into his voice. He gestured to 4 of his soldiers. "Remove this fool." The soldiers approached with weapons drawn, spreading out in a standard formation. The stranger, Rian would later learn his name was Kael Varro, simply watched them come, his hands hanging loose at his sides. The first soldier struck with his gladius, a competent thrust aimed at the stranger's midsection. What happened next took perhaps 3 seconds, but Rian would remember it for the rest of his life. Kael's hand moved in a blur, deflecting the blade with his forearm while simultaneously stepping inside the soldier's guard. His other hand snaked out, fingers finding pressure points on the Roman's wrist that made him drop his weapon with a cry of pain. Before the gladius hit the ground, Kael had swept the man's legs out from under him and sent him sprawling. The second soldier attacked from behind, but Kael seemed to sense him coming. He spun, catching the descending blade between his palms, in a move that should have been impossible, then wrenched it free and reversed it, slamming the pommel into the soldier's nose. Blood sprayed. The Roman went down hard. The third and fourth soldiers attacked simultaneously, trying to overwhelm him with numbers. Kael dropped low, sweeping one man's legs while driving his elbow into the other's solar plexus with enough force to knock the wind from him. As they fell, he rose smoothly, now holding 2 gladii, one in each hand, though he held them pointed down, not yet ready to kill. The entire encounter had lasted perhaps 5 heartbeats. The remaining soldiers stood frozen, suddenly very aware that they were facing someone far beyond their capabilities. The centurion's face had gone pale beneath his helmet. "Who are you?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady and failing. Kael tossed the gladii aside with a casual flick of his wrists. They clattered against the cobblestones, the sound impossibly loud in the sudden silence. "Someone who's tired," he said simply. "Tired of watching Rome take what isn't hers. Tired of men with swords thinking that makes them better than men without them." His gray eyes fixed on the centurion with an intensity that made the man take an involuntary step back. "And very, very tired of bullies who prey on the defenseless." "You dare the centurion started, his hand moving to his own weapon. "I dare," Kael interrupted, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, yet somehow carrying to every corner of the square. "And if you're smart, you'll take your men and leave. Now, while you still can." It was a bluff, of course. Even Ryan, still pinned to the ground, could see that. One man, no matter how skilled, couldn't defeat 30 trained soldiers. The mathematics of combat were brutally simple. But the centurion didn't know it was a bluff. All he saw was a man who'd dismantled 4 of his best soldiers with terrifying ease, who stood completely relaxed despite being surrounded, who spoke with the absolute certainty of someone who'd faced death so many times it had lost its sting. The calculation ran through the Roman's mind in an instant. Was enforcing this order worth dying over? "This isn't finished," the centurion finally said. Though everyone present could hear the retreat in his voice, he gestured to his men. "Fall back. We'll report this incident to the garrison." "Report whatever you want," Kael said, his tone utterly unconcerned. "But release the women first." The centurion's jaw worked, fury and humiliation warring across his features. But after a long moment, he jerked his head toward the wagons. "Let them go." The soldiers obeyed with obvious reluctance, opening the wagon gates. The women scrambled out, running back to their families. Rian watched Marin sprint toward him, tears still streaming down her face, and felt something break inside his chest, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of seeing her safe. As the Romans gathered their wounded and prepared to withdraw, the centurion turned back to Kael one last time. "You've made an enemy of Rome today, stranger," he said. "That's not a mistake people survive." Kael's expression didn't change. "Rome's made enemies of everyone in this province. How's that working out for you?" The centurion's face flushed with rage, but he said nothing more. Within minutes, the soldiers had mounted their horses and were riding away, leaving the village to count its wounds and blessings in equal measure. For a long moment after they'd gone, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire village seemed to be holding its breath, unable to quite believe what had just happened. Then, slowly, the whispers began. "Who is he? Did you see how he moved? He stopped Rome. Actually stopped them." Rian pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his head where the gladius pommel had struck him. Marin clung to his side, still shaking, but alive and whole. He should have been grateful, should have been relieved. Instead, he felt only a burning need to know more about this stranger who'd done what everyone said was impossible. Kael had already started walking away, his cloak settling back around his shoulders, seemingly intent on leaving as quickly and quietly as he'd arrived. "Wait!" Rian called out, pulling free from Marin's grip and jogging after him. "Wait, please!" Kael paused but didn't turn around. "Go back to your family, kid." "You just saved my sister, saved all of them. I need to—" Ryan struggled to find words adequate to the moment. "At least let me thank you properly. Let us feed you, give you a place to rest." "Not necessary." "Then let me ask you something." Rian moved around to face him, forcing the older man to meet his eyes. "Teach me." That got a reaction. Kael's eyebrows rose slightly. "Teach you what?" "To fight like that. To stand up to them." The words came pouring out now, all the rage and helplessness Rian had felt crystallizing into desperate purpose. "They'll come back, you know they will. And next time they'll bring more soldiers, and we'll be just as defenseless as we were today, and you'll die." Kael interrupted flatly. "You, your sister, everyone you love. Because that's what happens when ordinary people try to fight Rome. They don't become heroes, they become corpses." The words hit like physical blows, but Ryan forced himself to stand his ground. "So we should just submit? Let them take whatever they want, whoever they want." "You should survive." Kael's voice softened slightly, taking on an almost gentle quality that was somehow worse than anger. "Find a way to endure until circumstances change. That's not cowardice, kid. That's wisdom." "That's slavery," Rian shot back. "No," Kael said quietly. "Slavery is what you'll get if you fight and lose. Which you will, because you're not a warrior. You're a farmer pretending he understands violence. And violence doesn't care about your noble intentions or righteous anger. It just kills you and moves on." He turned to leave again, but Rian grabbed his arm, then immediately regretted it as Kael's hand snapped up, stopping a hair's breadth from Ryan's throat in a strike that would have crushed his windpipe. They stood frozen like that for a heartbeat, Kael's gray eyes boring into Rian's with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. Then Kael lowered his hand and stepped back. "Don't touch me. he said simply, without heat. And don't follow me. I'm not the answer you're looking for. This time, when he walked away, Rian let him go. The stranger, K. Alvaro, though Rian didn't know the name yet, found lodging in the small inn at the edge of Corvina. The innkeeper, a widow named Helena, was so grateful for what he'd done that she refused payment, but Kael insisted on leaving coins anyway. He'd learned long ago that debts, even debts of gratitude, had a way of becoming chains. His room was sparse, a narrow bed, a wash basin, a single window overlooking the street. Kael sat on the edge of the bed and began the ritual of checking his gear. Not that he had much, a traveler's pack, some spare clothes, a whetstone, and a gladius wrapped in oiled cloth that he hadn't drawn in 3 years. 3 years since he'd walked away from the arena. 3 years since he'd killed his last man. He unwrapped the gladius now, studying it in the lamplight. The blade was unremarkable. Standard Roman military issue, the kind carried by 1,000,000 soldiers across the empire. But it had been with him through 17 fights in the Colosseum, through blood and sand and screaming crowds. 17 times he'd survived when the odds said he should have died. 17 men who hadn't been so lucky. Kael wrapped the blade back up and shoved it to the bottom of his pack. He'd told himself when he left Rome that he was done with killing, done with being the empire's dancing monkey, entertainment for the masses. He'd bought his freedom with blood and coin, and he'd sworn he would never draw a blade in anger again. Today he'd almost broken that oath, for a handful of strangers in a village whose name he'd forget in a week. Idiot, he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. Should have just kept walking. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. He could no more have walked past that scene than he could have stopped breathing. Some part of him, the part that had survived the arena by never, ever giving up, couldn't abide seeing the strong prey on the weak, even when getting involved was the height of stupidity. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Kael tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward where his blade lay hidden, then forced himself to relax. "Come in," he called. The door opened to reveal the young man from the square. Rian. He stood in the doorway, looking uncertain, holding a wooden tray with bread, cheese, and what looked like watered wine. "Helena sent food," Rian said. "Said you needed to eat." Kael gestured to the small table by the window. "Leave it there." Rian did, but he didn't leave afterward. Instead, he lingered, clearly wanting to say something but struggling to find the words. "Spit it out," Kael said, not unkindly. "This afternoon," Rian began, "when you stopped those soldiers, you could have killed them. I saw it. They were completely at your mercy. But you didn't. Your point? Why not?" Rian moved further into the room, his intensity palpable. "They were going to take our women, turn them into property for Roman pleasure. They've burned villages, killed people who resisted. Why show them mercy?" Kyle was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth to share. Finally he said, "Because killing a Roman soldier makes you a rebel. And Rome doesn't negotiate with rebels. She destroys them, roots and branches, until nothing remains but scorched earth and examples for others to learn from." "So you were protecting us by not killing them?" "I was protecting you from yourselves." Kael's voice hardened. "That centurion knows he can't take me in a fair fight, but he's already riding back to his garrison reporting this incident. Within a week, maybe 2, soldiers will come looking for the man who humiliated Rome. They'll ask questions, search the area. And when they don't find me, because I'll be long gone, they'll need someone to punish." The color drained from Ryan's face as understanding dawned. "Us. They'll punish us." "Maybe. Probably not, since I'm clearly an outsider and you had nothing to do with it. But there's a chance." Kael leaned forward, fixing Rian with a hard stare. "That's why you don't fight Rome, kid. Because even when you win, you lose." "Then how do you beat them?" The question came out almost as a whisper. "You don't." Kael turned away, reaching for the bread Helena had sent. "Now get out. I'm tired." But Rian didn't move. "I don't believe that. I don't believe you believe that. If you really thought Rome was unbeatable, you would have walked past us today. You wouldn't have risked yourself for strangers." "Clever kid." Kael felt a flicker of reluctant respect. What I did today was a mistake, he said. A moment of weakness where I forgot the most important lesson the arena taught me. Survival matters more than honor. I won't make that mistake again. But enough. Kael's voice cracked like a whip. I don't know what you think I am, but I'm not your savior. I'm not going to train you to be some kind of rebel hero. I'm a drifter who got involved in something that wasn't his business, and tomorrow morning I'll be gone. That's the end of the story. He expected Rian to argue, to plead, maybe even to get angry. Instead, the young man just nodded slowly, a strange expression crossing his face. Not defeat, but something else. Calculation, maybe. Or determination. Thank you for the food, Kael said pointedly, and for earlier, for understanding. Now, my sister wanted me to give you this. Rian pulled something from his pocket and set it on the table. A simple leather bracelet, hand-braided with obvious care. She makes them when she's nervous. It's not much, but I can't accept this. She'll be offended if you refuse. Cultural thing. Rian was already backing toward the door. Just think about what I said, about not believing Rome is unbeatable. Because the moment people start believing that, really believing it, then it becomes true. He left before Kael could respond, closing the door softly behind him. Kael sat alone in the lamplight, staring at the bracelet. It was a simple thing, obviously made by amateur hands, worth nothing by any objective measure. After a long moment, he picked it up and slipped it into his pack. 3 days passed. Kael told himself he was just taking time to rest before moving on. The road was long, and winter was coming. A few more days wouldn't hurt. It was a lie, of course. He knew why he was staying, even if he wouldn't admit it. He was waiting. On the 4th morning, Ryan found him in the inn's common room, breaking his fast with bread and fruit. They're back, Rian said without preamble, his face ashen. The Romans. Different group, bigger. At least 50 soldiers. They're setting up camp outside the village. Kael felt something cold settle in his stomach. Your centurion called for reinforcements faster than I expected. What do we do? We? Kael raised an eyebrow. You don't do anything. You stay in your home, you keep your head down, and you hope they're just here to intimidate, not retaliate. And you? I'll be gone before they finish setting up their tents. Kael stood, draining the last of his water. Tell your people to cooperate fully. Don't give them any excuse to escalate. He started toward the stairs to collect his gear, but Ryan's next words stopped him cold. They brought a list. Kael turned slowly. What kind of list? Names, women's names, 50 of them. Rian's voice shook with barely suppressed fury. They're not asking this time. They're taking, and if anyone resists, they'll burn the village and kill the men as a lesson. For a long moment, Kael said nothing. His mind was already calculating distances, routes, how far he could get before the Romans secured the perimeter. He could make it. Easily. He was faster on foot than mounted soldiers, knew how to move through terrain without leaving tracks. By this time tomorrow, he'd be 2 valleys over, completely clear of this mess. All he had to do was walk away. I'm sorry, Rian said quietly, and the apology in his voice made Kael look at him sharply. I know this isn't your fight. I know you warned us. But I had to tell you because I thought you deserved to know what your mercy cost us. The words hit harder than any physical blow could have, because they were true. Kael's decision to humiliate the Romans, rather than kill them, had prompted this response. His mercy had doomed these people to a harsher punishment than if he'd simply walked past in the first place. The road to hell, paved with good intentions. Get everyone to the village center, Kael heard himself say. Everyone, men, women, children, within the hour. Rian's eyes widened. You're going to help us? I'm going to try something incredibly stupid that will probably get us all killed, Kael corrected. But first, I need you to answer a question honestly. How many fighting-age men in this village? Maybe 40, 45? How many would actually fight if it came to it? Rian hesitated, then said, maybe half. The rest have families, children. They'd want to, but 20 fighters then. Farmers and craftsmen with no training. Kael laughed, but there was no humor in it. against 50 Roman soldiers with armor, weapons, and years of experience. The gods must be laughing. So there's no chance? Oh, there's always a chance, Kael said. Just a very, very small one. But it's better than none. He grabbed Rian by the shoulders, forcing the younger man to meet his eyes. If I do this, if I help you, you need to understand something. People are going to die, maybe a lot of people. There's no clean way out of this. I understand. No, you don't. But you will. Kael released him and started toward the stairs. Get everyone gathered. And Rian, bring whatever weapons you have. Anything sharp, anything heavy. We're going to need every advantage we can get. Within the hour, the village center was packed with frightened, confused people. Kael stood on the steps of the meeting hall, looking out at faces that ranged from hopeful to terrified to openly hostile. Some clearly thought he was their salvation. Others saw him as the fool who'd brought Roman wrath down on their heads. Both were probably right. Most of you know what happened 3 days ago, Kael began, his voice carrying across the square. I interfered with a Roman operation. That was my choice, my action. What's happening now is the consequence. Muttering rippled through the crowd. The Romans have returned with reinforcements, Kael continued. They're here to enforce the emperor's decree, to take 50 women from this province for imperial service. They have a list, they have authorization, and they have explicit orders to destroy any village that resists. Then we have no choice, someone shouted. We have to give them what they want. No. Rian stepped forward, his voice ringing with passion. We've given them enough. First our grain, then our silver, now our daughters. Where does it end? It ends when we're all dead, an older woman cried out. You're young, Rian called her. You don't remember what happened to Valerica when they refused Rome. The soldiers killed everyone, children, elders, everyone. Then they burned the fields so nothing would grow for years. Is that what you want for us? The crowd erupted into arguments, fear and anger feeding on each other. Kael let it go on for a moment, understanding that they needed to voice their terror before they could move past it. Then he raised his hand, and somehow the gesture commanded silence. The woman is right, he said simply. Open resistance means destruction. Rome has proven that time and again. They have the numbers, the training, the resources. They will crush you without breaking stride. Rian looked at him with betrayal in his eyes. Then why did you tell me to gather everyone? Because there's a difference between open resistance and smart resistance. Kael descended the steps, moving through the crowd. You can't beat Rome in a straight fight, but you don't have to fight straight. He stopped next to an older man holding a pitchfork. You. What's your name? Marcus. I don't care who you are or what you do. I care whether you can follow orders. Kael's gray eyes bored into the man. Can you? Marcus straightened his shoulders. Yes. Good. Kael moved on to a woman in her 30s. Can you shoot a bow? My father taught me when I was young, but I haven't. You have until sunset to remember how. Kael pointed to another man. You look strong. Can you move quietly? I don't know. Then you're about to learn. He moved through the crowd like this, assessing, categorizing, forming a mental picture of what resources he had to work with. It wasn't much. Most of these people had never held a weapon in anger. They were soft, civilian. Everything the arena had taught him was a liability in combat. But they had something the Romans didn't. They were fighting for their homes, their families. That desperation, properly channeled, could be sharper than any blade. When he returned to the steps, Kael addressed the crowd again. Here's what's going to happen. The Romans will march into this village tomorrow morning expecting compliance. They think you're broken, afraid, ready to hand over your daughters to save yourselves. And they're right, most of you are. He let that sink in. But not all of you, he continued. Some of you are angry enough, desperate enough, crazy enough to fight back. To those people, I'm offering a choice. Come with me tonight. I'll teach you what I can in the time we have. I'll show you how to turn your fear into fury, your desperation into discipline. And tomorrow, when the Romans come, we'll show them that Lusitania isn't broken, not yet. And for the rest of us, someone called out, the ones with children, with families who can't risk, You do exactly what the Romans expect, Kael said. You cooperate, you comply, you survive. No one here will judge you for choosing to live, but understand this, if we fight and lose, if this goes badly, you need to have a story ready. You knew nothing about any resistance. You were victims, caught between Roman occupation and local extremists. The more convincing you are, the better chance you have of surviving the aftermath. It was brutal calculus, dividing the village into fighters and survivors, but Kael had learned in the arena that successful tactics required accepting hard truths. You worked with what you had, not what you wished you had. So what's the plan? Rian asked, stepping up beside him. How do we fight 50 Roman soldiers? Kael looked at the young man who'd dragged him into this mess, seeing the determination in his eyes, the willingness to die for something beyond himself. The kid reminded him of someone Kael had been a long time ago, before the arena had beaten the idealism out of him and replaced it with cold pragmatism. We don't fight them, Kael said. We make them fight each other. We turn their strengths into weaknesses, their confidence into fear. And we pray to whatever gods still listen that we survive long enough to see sunrise. He raised his voice so the entire crowd could hear. Anyone who wants to help, meet me in the old barn on the east edge of town in 1 hour. Bring whatever weapons you have, and bring your courage, because you're going to need it. As the crowd dispersed, some heading home to prepare, others to hide, Kael felt the weight of what he'd just committed to settling on his shoulders. 20 untrained civilians against 50 battle-hardened Romans. The odds were suicide. But then again, he'd beaten worse odds in the arena. And at least this time, he'd be fighting for something that mattered. 23 people showed up at the barn. 23, out of a village of over 200. Kael had hoped for more, but he'd expected less. He studied the faces before him in the lamplight. Young men like Rian and Declan, their eyes burning with righteous fury. Older men who'd seen too much to have illusions about war but came anyway. Even a handful of women, including one who introduced herself as Sarah, a hunter who could put an arrow through a rabbit's eye at 50 paces. They were farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, and herders. None of them warriors. But they were here. That counted for something. Let's start with what you know, Kael said, pacing before them like a general addressing troops. Who here has killed a man? Silence. Exactly what he expected. Who's been in a fight? Actual violence, not drunk wrestling at festivals. A few hands went up, including Declan's. Good. You'll be squad leaders. Who can shoot? Sarah and 2 others raised their hands. Archers. Who's fast? I mean really fast, can run for miles without stopping. More hands. Kael nodded, the tactical picture forming in his mind. All right. Here's the truth. You can't beat a Roman soldier in single combat. Their training is too good, their equipment too superior. They fought in Germania, Britannia, Parthia, places where the enemies were fierce and numerous and still lost. You're going to lose too, if you try to fight them their way. He saw hope beginning to die in some eyes, but he pressed on. So we're not going to fight them their way. We're going to fight them our way. We're going to use the terrain, the darkness, psychology. We're going to make them afraid. And when men are afraid, even the best training in the world falls apart. How do you make a Roman soldier afraid? Rian asked. Kael smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. By showing them that they're not invincible, that their armor can be pierced, their formations can be broken, their certainty can become doubt. Fear is a contagion, and we're going to be patient zero. He spent the next hour teaching them the basics. Not how to fight, there wasn't time for that, but how to kill. He showed them where to strike to disable rather than wound, how to move quietly, how to use darkness and surprise to multiply their effectiveness. He taught them that honor was a luxury they couldn't afford. If you get into a fair fight, you've already lost, Kael explained, demonstrating a strike to the back of the knee that would cripple a man. Your goal isn't to prove you're a better warrior, it's to survive and make them pay as dearly as possible for what they're taking. The lessons were brutal, stripped of any romantic notions of combat. Several people looked sick as Kael explained how to quietly kill a sentry, how to hamstring a soldier so he couldn't pursue, how to create chaos in formations by targeting officers. But they listened, and they learned. As midnight approached, Kael divided them into teams. The archers would provide covering fire from elevated positions. The fast runners would be harassment. Dart in, strike, vanish before the Romans could respond. The strong ones would set traps and obstacles. And Ryan's group, the most committed, the most desperate, would be the spear tip, the ones who'd actually engage the enemy directly. One more thing, Kael said as they prepared to disperse. Some of you are going to die tomorrow. Maybe all of us. That's not pessimism, it's reality. But if we do this right, if we follow the plan and don't let fear turn into panic, we have a chance. A small one, but it's there. He looked at each face in turn, burning them into memory. Your families are counting on you. Your village is counting on you, and I'm counting on you. Don't let them down. As they filed out into the night to take their positions, Ryan lingered behind. That speech, he said quietly. Did you give speeches like that in the arena? Kael shook his head. In the arena, you fought alone. No speeches, no inspiring words. Just you and the other man and the certainty that one of you wouldn't leave that sand alive. How many times did you fight? 17? And you won every time. Obviously, Kael began checking his gear, making sure everything was in place. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The men you killed, Rian hesitated. Do you remember them? Kael's hands stilled. It was a question no one had ever asked him before, not in all the years since he'd left Rome. Everyone, he said softly. Their faces, their last words, the exact moment the light went out of their eyes. I remember all of it. That's the price you pay for surviving when others don't. Does it get easier? No. Kael looked up, meeting Rian's eyes. And the day it does get easier is the day you stop being human. Remember that, when this is over. Whatever you do tomorrow, whoever you hurt, it should cost you something. That's how you know you're still one of the good ones. Rian nodded slowly, absorbing this. Then, surprising Kael, he held out his hand. Thank you, Rian said. For staying, for helping us. I know you didn't have to. Kael took the offered hand, feeling the calluses from years of farm work, the strength in the grip. Thank me if we survive, he said. And Rian, stay close to me tomorrow. You've got potential, but potential doesn't mean anything if you die before you can realize it. They stood there in the darkness, two men from completely different worlds, united by circumstance and the desperate hope that tomorrow wouldn't be their last day. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out below. And in the Roman camp beyond the village, 50 soldiers settled in for the night, completely unaware that the frightened farmers they'd come to intimidate were preparing to bite back. Dawn would bring answers, dawn would bring blood, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first gray light of dawn crept over the Lusitanian hills like a thief, casting long shadows across the Roman encampment. Inside his tent, Centurion Marcus Flavius had been awake for hours, reviewing his orders with the kind of meticulous attention that had kept him alive through 20 years of military service. 50 women. Specific names on a list provided by the provincial governor. A simple extraction operation that should be completed by midday, leaving him plenty of time to return to the garrison before nightfall. The only complication was the stranger, the man who'd humiliated Decurion Cassius and his patrol 3 days prior. Flavius had read the report with growing disbelief. One unarmed civilian disabling 4 trained legionaries in the space of a few heartbeats? Either Cassius was incompetent, or the stranger was something far more dangerous than a common drifter. Flavius suspected both were true. Still, one man, no matter how skilled, couldn't stand against 50. The mathematics of combat were absolute. Flavius had learned that truth in the forests of Germania, where his legion had turned back 3,000 screaming barbarians through nothing more than superior discipline and formation tactics. These Lusitanians would break the moment they saw real Roman steel. They always did. Sir? A young Optio ducked into the tent, his face flushed from the morning cold. The men are formed and ready. Shall we advance? Flavius nodded, reaching for his helmet, the distinctive transverse crest that marked his rank. Standard intimidation formation. Shields front, spears visible. I want these villagers to understand exactly what they're facing before we even speak. And if they resist? Then we make an example that every other village in this province will remember. Flavius's voice carried no emotion. He'd made examples before. It was simply part of the job. But I doubt it will come to that. The scout reports say the village is quiet. No signs of preparation, no fortifications. They know they can't win. The Optio saluted and withdrew. Flavius took a moment to study himself in the polished bronze mirror hanging from his tent pole. The face that looked back was weathered, scarred, utterly certain of its purpose. Rome had given him everything: status, purpose, a path out of the poverty he'd been born into. In return, he gave Rome his absolute loyalty and his willingness to do whatever was necessary to maintain the empire's order. Even when necessary meant things that kept him awake some nights, staring at tent canvas and wondering when he'd stop seeing the people he conquered as human. He pushed the thought away. Sentiment was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. Outside, his men were assembled in perfect ranks, their segmented armor gleaming despite the early hour, their shields locked in the testudo formation that had conquered half the known world. Flavius took his position at the front, raising his vine stick, the symbol of his authority. "Forward," he commanded, "for Rome and the emperor." The response was instantaneous, 50 voices unified in purpose. "For Rome." They began their march toward the village, and Flavius allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. This would be over before breakfast. He had no idea how wrong he was. Cale watched the Roman formation approach from his position in the bell tower of the village's modest temple, his eyes tracking their movements with the analytical detachment of a predator studying prey. Beside him, Sarah fitted an arrow to her bow, her hands remarkably steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "Textbook intimidation march," Kael murmured, more to himself than to her. "Shields front, weapons visible, perfect spacing. They're trying to make us panic before they even arrive." "Is it working?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "On most of the village?" "Probably." Kael shifted his gaze to the streets below, where he could see shutters being quickly closed, doors barred, people retreating into their homes. "But not on the ones we need." He could see them, his 23 volunteers positioned exactly where he'd placed them during the night. Rian and 5 others hidden in the granary with weapons made from farming implements that Kael had shown them how to modify. Declan and the strong ones waiting in the shadowed alley near the blacksmith's forge, ready to spring the first trap. The fast runners scattered throughout the village, prepared to lead the Romans into the kill zones Kael had carefully mapped out. They looked terrified, all of them, but they were in position, and that was what mattered. "Remember the plan," Kael said to Sarah. "You don't shoot until I give the signal, and when you do, you aim for the officers, the ones with the fancier helmets. Take them down first, and the formation starts to crack." "I've never shot at a person before," Sarah confessed, her knuckles white on the bow. "Rabbits, deer, even a wolf once, but never a man." "A man's just another target." Kael's voice was flat, deliberately devoid of comfort. "Bigger, moves different, but the principle's the same. Find your mark, breathe out, release. Don't think about who he is or who's waiting for him back in Rome. Just shoot." Sarah nodded, though he could see her swallow hard. Below, the Roman formation had reached the village edge. Flavius called a halt, and the perfect rank stopped as one, shields still raised, spears still gleaming. "People of Corvina," Flavius's voice carried with the practiced projection of a career military man. "By order of Governor Aurelius Maximus and the authority of the emperor, you are hereby commanded to produce the 50 women whose names appear on the provincial registry. Compliance will be rewarded. Resistance will be punished." Silence greeted his proclamation. The kind of heavy, absolute silence that precedes violence. Flavius frowned. Usually by now, village elders would be emerging, wringing their hands, begging for mercy, or trying to negotiate. The complete absence of response was unusual. "This is your final warning," Flavius called out. "Produce the required individuals within the next 10 minutes, or we will consider this village an open rebellion against Rome. The penalty for rebellion is death and destruction. Choose wisely." Still nothing. Kael felt a grim satisfaction. The silence was working exactly as he'd planned. Romans were used to fear, to desperate compliance, to the immediate collapse of civilian will when confronted with military might. This unexpected quiet was making them uncertain, and uncertainty bred mistakes. "Sir," the Optio beside Flavius ventured, "perhaps they didn't understand. Should we—" The arrow seemed to come from nowhere, a blur of wood and feather that struck the Optio in the throat before he could finish his sentence. He went down with a gurgling cry, blood spraying across the centurion's armor. Kael hadn't given the signal. He spun toward Sarah, but her bow was still drawn and unfired, her eyes wide with shock, which meant someone else had shot, one of the other archers, panic or eagerness overcoming discipline. The plan had called for a coordinated strike. This was chaos, but there was no time to curse the error. The game was in motion now. "Ambush!" Flavius roared, his training overcoming shock in an instant. "Testudo formation! Locate the archer!" The Roman shield snapped together overhead, creating an interlocking barrier against further arrows. It was a defensive formation, nearly impenetrable from above, which made it perfect for exactly one thing, keeping them stationary. "Now," Kael said quietly to Sarah. "Officer with the transverse crest. Center of formation." Sarah drew and released in one smooth motion. The arrow struck Flavius's shoulder, punching through a gap in his armor, and the centurion staggered with a cry of pain and fury. The formation wavered. Not much. Roman discipline was legendary for a reason, but enough. That was when Declan and his team released the cart. They'd loaded it during the night with rocks, broken furniture, anything heavy they could find, and positioned it at the top of the sloping street that led down into the village square. Now, with the Romans bunched together in their defensive formation, Declan and 3 others shoved it forward with all their strength. The cart picked up speed quickly, its wooden wheels screaming against cobblestones as it hurtled down the slope directly toward the Testudo formation. "Break formation!" someone in the Roman ranks yelled. "Move!" But formations didn't break easily, especially when the men in them had been drilled to maintain position no matter what. By the time the soldiers realized the danger, the cart was already on them. It hit like a battering ram, scattering shields and men alike, the heavy cargo spilling out in a wave of debris that knocked soldiers off their feet and created gaps in the previously impenetrable wall. Into those gaps rushed Ryan and his team. They didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like desperate animals, striking from the sides and behind, targeting knees and hamstrings and any exposed flesh they could reach. A modified scythe opened a soldier's leg from hip to ankle. A weighted chain wrapped around another's neck, dragging him down. A blacksmith's hammer crushed a knee with a sickening crunch. It was brutal, inelegant, and completely effective. The Romans, trained for battlefield combat against similarly equipped opponents, suddenly found themselves fighting an enemy that ignored every rule of warfare they'd been taught. There was no honor here, no formation versus formation. Just chaos and pain, and the realization that these weren't the broken civilians they'd expected. "Fall back!" Flavius commanded, one hand pressed against his wounded shoulder, the other still gripping his gladius. "Regroup at the—" Another arrow, this one from a different direction, struck the ground at his feet. Then another. The Romans couldn't locate the archers because they were everywhere, shooting from windows, from rooftops, from behind barricaded doors. It was a nightmare of urban combat, and Flavius realized with growing horror that they'd walked straight into a trap. "Controlled retreat," he shouted. "Shield wall, back toward the camp." But Kael had anticipated that too. As the Romans began to withdraw in their disciplined formation, they found the street behind them blocked by overturned carts, piles of debris, anything the villagers could use to create obstacles. The fast runners Kael had positioned were already at work, darting in to set small fires, to spread oil that made the cobblestones treacherously slick, to create chaos wherever the Romans tried to establish order. Flavius felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine fear. Not for his life. He'd faced death too many times to fear it, but fear that he'd lost control of the situation, that his men were dying for a mission that should have been routine. "Form square," he commanded. "Protect the wounded. We hold until—" A figure dropped from a rooftop directly into the center of the Roman formation. Kael landed in a crouch, his gladius already drawn and moving before the nearest soldier could react. The blade found the gap between armor plates, sliding between ribs, and the soldier fell without a sound. For a heartbeat, The Romans stared at this apparition who dropped into their midst with the casual confidence of a man who'd done this 100 times before. Then Kael moved. He was a storm made flesh, every motion economical and deadly, every strike finding its mark. He didn't waste energy on flourishes or intimidation. He simply killed with the cold efficiency of someone who'd learned the craft in the most brutal school imaginable. A gladius thrust aimed at his midsection was deflected with his forearm, while his own blade opened the attacker's throat. A shield bash that should have crushed his ribs was dodged with a minimal shift of his body, and the overextended soldier found Kael's blade punching through his armpit into his heart. Flavius watched in horrified fascination as this single man carved through his soldiers like they were training dummies. The stranger's technique was perfect, not in the ceremonial sense, but in the brutal practicality of someone who'd survived against impossible odds by never making the same mistake twice. And then Kael's eyes found Flavius, and the centurion understood with absolute clarity that he was looking at his own death. "Hold him," Flavius commanded, but his voice lacked conviction. "How did you hold a man who moved like water and struck like lightning?" Kael advanced, and 3 soldiers moved to intercept. The first lost his sword hand to a precise strike that severed tendons. The second took a pommel to the temple that sent him crashing down unconscious. The third managed to block Kael's initial strike, but wasn't prepared for the follow-up, a savage kick to the knee that shattered bone and brought him screaming to the ground. And then Kael was standing before Flavius, his blade pressed against the centurion's throat, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "Call them off," Kael said quietly, his gray eyes boring into Flavius's. "Order your men to withdraw, and this ends now." Flavius felt the cold kiss of steel against his skin, saw the absolute certainty of death in those gray eyes, and made a calculation. He'd lost this fight. Pride demanded he refuse, that he die rather than surrender to provincials and criminals. But pragmatism whispered that a living centurion could return with reinforcements, could avenge this humiliation properly. A dead one was just another casualty. "Stand down!" Flavius called out, his voice steady despite the blade at his throat. "All units, cease combat and withdraw to secondary positions." The fighting didn't stop immediately. Combat has its own momentum, and frightened men don't always hear orders the first time. But gradually, the clash of steel began to fade, replaced by the groans of wounded men and the crackling of the fires that had been set. Kael didn't lower his blade. "Your men gather the wounded and return to your camp. You leave at first light tomorrow and don't come back. Ever." "I can't agree to that," Flavius said, though the words cost him. "My orders—" "Your orders just got 30 of your men killed or wounded." Kael's voice was ice. "How many more are you willing to sacrifice for a governor's vanity project? Because I promise you, centurion, we can do this again and again. Every Roman patrol that enters this valley, every tax collector, every official, they all become targets. Is that what you want? Endless guerrilla warfare where every shadow might hide an enemy?" Flavius wanted to spit defiance, to tell this arrogant rebel exactly what Rome did to insurgents. But he was a practical man, and he could read terrain, tactical and political. This stranger had just demonstrated that the villagers weren't helpless. Pushing forward would mean more casualties, and explaining why he'd lost 50 men to capture 50 women would end his career at best, his life at worst. 24 hours, Flavius said. "We withdraw and report that this village was abandoned when we arrived. But hear me, stranger, Rome doesn't forget. She may not come tomorrow or next month, but she will come. And when she does, it won't be 50 soldiers. It'll be a legion." "Then we'll kill a legion." Kael's voice held no bravado, just flat certainty. "Go back to your governor and tell him that Lusitania is done bleeding for Rome's pleasure. The next Roman who tries to take what isn't his will die choking on his own arrogance." He stepped back, lowering his blade, and Flavius felt the tension drain from his shoulders. Around them, Roman soldiers were already helping their wounded toward the village edge, their formation discipline maintained even in retreat. As Flavius turned to join them, he paused. "What's your name, stranger? When I make my report, they'll want to know who led this resistance." Kael considered the question, knowing that giving his name meant giving Rome a target. But he was already a target. Might as well own it. "Kael Varro," he said. "Former gladiator of Rome. champion of the Colosseum 17 times, and the man who just taught your soldiers that arrogance isn't the same as invincibility. Recognition flashed across Flavius's face. The shadow of the sands? I saw you fight once in Rome. You were magnificent. I was a slave killing other slaves for entertainment, Kael corrected coldly. There was nothing magnificent about it. Now go, before I change my mind about letting you live. Flavius nodded once, a gesture that held more respect than any Roman would normally show a provincial rebel, and withdrew with his remaining men. The villagers emerged slowly from their hiding places as the Romans retreated, their faces a mixture of shock, relief, and disbelief. They'd done it. Against all odds, against Rome itself, they'd won. But as Kael watched the Roman column disappear over the hills, he felt no triumph, only a cold certainty that this was just the beginning, and that what came next would make today's bloodshed look like a training exercise. The celebration that night was muted, tempered by the reality of their casualties. 3 villagers had died in the fighting, 2 men and one of the archers who'd been caught by a Roman javelin. 7 more were wounded, some seriously enough that their survival was uncertain. Kael refused to join the festivities, such as they were. Instead, he sat alone in the temple, cleaning his gladius with methodical precision, trying not to think about the men he'd killed today. He'd broken his oath. 3 years of peace ended in a single morning of violence, and the worst part was how easy it had been to slip back into that mindset, that cold calculation of angles and vulnerabilities and the exact amount of force needed to end a life. The arena had taught him well, and those lessons didn't fade just because you wanted them to. They're calling you a hero. Kael didn't need to look up to know it was Rian. The young man's footsteps had a distinctive pattern, still favoring his left leg from where he'd taken a glancing blow during the fight. Heroes don't exist, Kael said, not pausing in his cleaning. Just people who survive while others don't. Rian limped into the temple, carrying 2 wooden cups that smelled of strong wine. He set one beside Kael, then lowered himself to the floor with a grimace. My father used to say something similar, Ryan said. He fought in the border wars 20 years ago, before the treaties. Came back different, my mother said. Quieter. Like part of him had stayed on the battlefield. Smart man. He died 5 years ago. Fever took him in winter. Rian took a long drink from his cup. Never got to tell him I understood what he'd been trying to teach me about violence and its costs. I was too young, too stupid. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft rasp of cloth on steel as Kael continued his maintenance ritual. Finally, Ryan spoke again. What you said to that centurion about killing a legion if they come back. Can we actually do that? Kael set down his blade and looked at Rian properly for the first time since the young man had entered. Honestly, no. What we did today worked because we had surprise, terrain advantage, and an enemy who underestimated us. A legion wouldn't make those mistakes. They'd siege us properly, starve us out, and then crucify every fighting-age male as a warning to others. Then why did you say it? Because Flavius needed to believe we could, needed to believe that pacifying this village would cost more than it was worth. Kael picked up the wine cup, studying its contents. But belief and reality are different things. In reality, we just signed this village's death warrant. It's only a question of when Rome decides to collect. Rian's face paled. Then what do? We prepare. We train. And we hope that when the hammer falls, we're ready to survive it. Kael drained the cup in one long swallow, feeling the wine burn down his throat. Tomorrow, we start building proper defenses. Walls, traps, escape routes, and I start teaching you and anyone else willing to learn how to actually fight, not just survive a single ambush. You're staying then? There was hope in Rian's voice, bright and dangerous. I'm staying, Kael confirmed, though the words felt like accepting a sentence. I've already made myself Rome's enemy. Might as well be thorough about it. Rian smiled, the expression transforming his face despite the bruises and cuts that marked it. You know, when I first saw you in that tavern, I thought you were just another drifter, someone running from his past, looking for a place to disappear. I am. Kael started reassembling his gladius. But the past has a way of finding you, no matter how far you run. Maybe you weren't running from it, Rien suggested. Maybe you were running toward something. Toward this. Toward a purpose that matters. Kale wanted to tell him he was wrong, that there was no grand destiny at play, just a series of bad decisions that had led to an inevitable confrontation. But looking at Rien's earnest face, seeing the belief there, he couldn't bring himself to crush it. Get some rest, he said instead. Tomorrow, the real work begins. 3 weeks passed in a blur of brutal training and frantic preparation. Kale drove his volunteers mercilessly, teaching them not just how to fight, but how to think like fighters. He showed them how to read terrain, how to turn everyday objects into weapons, how to work as a unit instead of a mob. The lessons were harsh, often conducted at dawn or late into the night, leaving everyone exhausted and covered in bruises. But they learned. Rien proved to have a natural talent for tactics, able to see patterns in chaos and predict enemy movements with surprising accuracy. Declan's raw strength, properly channeled, made him devastating in close combat. Sarah's archery improved to the point where she could put 3 arrows in a man-sized target at 70 paces in under 10 seconds. The others progressed at varying rates, but they all progressed. Fear was a powerful motivator, and every one of them knew that Rome would return eventually. Kale also oversaw the construction of defensive works around the village. Nothing elaborate. They didn't have the resources or expertise for proper fortifications, but enough to make any future assault costly. Sharpened stakes hidden in tall grass, pits covered with false floors that would collapse under a horse's weight, fire-starting materials pre-positioned at strategic points, and escape routes. Always escape routes. Because Kyle knew that no defense was perfect, and when the walls finally fell, survival would depend on being able to vanish into the wilderness. During this time, word of Corvina's resistance began to spread through the province. Other villages sent representatives, some seeking advice, others offering support. A few brave souls even came to join the training, swelling Kyle's force to nearly 50. It wasn't an army, it wasn't even a proper militia, but it was something, and something was better than nothing. On the 21st day, a messenger arrived from the provincial capital. Kyle was in the training yard, demonstrating a disarming technique to a group of recruits when Ryan came running with news. "Rider approaching," the young man panted. "Single horseman, no armor, carrying a white flag." Kale straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Diplomatic envoy. Interesting. Rome doesn't usually negotiate with rebels. Could be a trap?" "Probably is." Kale gestured to Sarah and 2 others. "Position yourselves where you can take him down if needed, but don't shoot unless I give the word." They assembled in the village square as the rider approached, a thin man in expensive civilian clothes, his face bearing the pinched look of a bureaucrat who'd spent too long behind desks and not enough time in the real world. He dismounted with obvious discomfort, clearly unused to long rides, and approached Kyle with a scroll held prominently in his hands. "I seek the one called Kyle Varro," the man announced in accented Lusitanian. "I bear a message from Governor Aurelius Maximus." "I'm Varro. Speak." The bureaucrat unrolled his scroll with exaggerated precision. "By order of Governor Aurelius Maximus, acting with the full authority of the Roman Senate and people, the following proclamation is made. The village of Corvina and its inhabitants are hereby declared in open rebellion against Rome. A bounty of 10,000 denarii is placed upon the head of the rebel leader Kyle Varro, dead or alive. All citizens of Lusitania are commanded to provide no aid or comfort to the rebels, upon pain of death. Furthermore, Kale interrupted, his voice cold as winter steel. You can tell your governor that his threats are as empty as his promises of Roman justice. We don't recognize his authority, and we won't be intimidated by his proclamations." The bureaucrat's face flushed. "You dare speak such treason openly? Do you not understand the power you're defying?" "I understand it perfectly. I was raised in it, trained by it, nearly destroyed by it." Kale stepped closer, and the bureaucrat instinctively retreated. "What you don't understand is that we're done being afraid. Your empire has taken everything from these people, their crops, their coin, their children. You've left them with nothing to lose, and people with nothing to lose are the most dangerous enemies you can make." "The governor offers terms," the bureaucrat said quickly, clearly eager to deliver his message and depart. Surrender yourself to Roman justice, and the village will be spared. Your execution will be public, as befits a traitor, but the rest of Corvina may continue to exist under imperial oversight. Rian started forward, fury on his face, but Kyle raised a hand to stop him. Tempting offer, Kyle said with a cold smile. Let me counter. Your governor withdraws all Roman forces from this valley, cancels his recruitment orders, and leaves these people alone. In exchange, I won't make it my life's work to turn every village in Lusitania into another Corvina. Seems fair. The bureaucrat's laugh was nervous, uncertain. You cannot be serious. One village against the might of Rome? One village today, Kale agreed. But how many tomorrow? How many provincial settlements are watching to see if resistance is possible? How many people are tired of Roman arrogance and just need to see someone stand up to it? He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. You tell your governor that he can spend a fortune in blood and coin trying to crush us, or he can cut his losses and find somewhere else to steal women from. His choice. The bureaucrat stepped back, nearly stumbling in his haste. This is madness. You'll all die. Probably, Kale acknowledged. But we'll die free, and that's more than we'd be if we submitted to Rome. Now leave, before my people decide that killing you would send a stronger message than letting you live. The bureaucrat didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled onto his horse and spurred it away, the scroll forgotten in the dirt. As the dust settled from his departure, Rian turned to Kyle with a troubled expression. 10,000 denarii, he said quietly. That's enough to buy a villa in Rome. Enough to tempt anyone, even people we trust. I know. Kale watched the rider disappear over the hills. That's the point. Rome wants us to tear ourselves apart from within, to betray each other for their gold. It's cheaper than sending another legion, and often just as effective. So what do we do? Kale looked around at the assembled villagers, seeing fear and determination in equal measure on their faces. These weren't warriors. They were farmers and craftsmen and merchants, ordinary people pushed to extraordinary measures by extraordinary circumstances. But they were his people now, his responsibility. We trust each other, he said simply, and we prepare for the worst. The worst came sooner than expected. 2 nights after the envoy's departure, the sentries spotted fires in the hills, dozens of them, arranged in a pattern that could only mean one thing. Rome was coming, and this time they weren't sending a patrol. Kyle stood on the temple roof, counting the fires, calculating numbers and distances. At least 200 soldiers, possibly more. A full cohort, maybe 2, with cavalry support and siege equipment. Flavius had kept his word about not returning personally, but he'd sent friends. Can we win? Rian asked, having climbed up to join him in the darkness. Kyle was silent for a long moment, running through tactics and scenarios, looking for any angle that might give them a chance. No, he said finally, not in a direct confrontation. They'll surround us, siege us, wait until we're weak from hunger and thirst, then storm the village and kill everyone. That's proper Roman tactics, and we don't have the resources to counter them. Then we run. Some of us. Kale turned to face the young man who'd dragged him into this fight. The non-combatants, the children, the elderly, they evacuate tonight using the routes we prepared. Head into the deep wilderness where Roman cavalry can't follow. Scatter into small groups, make it impossible to track you all. And the fighters? We stay. We buy time for the others to escape, make the Romans think the whole village is still here. Kale's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing crop rotation instead of a suicide mission. We won't win, but we can make them pay for every inch. Make them remember that conquering Lusitania isn't as easy as conquering provinces that have already given up hope. Rian was quiet, processing this. Then he said, "There's another option. I'm listening. We don't wait for them to come to us, we go to them." Rian's eyes gleamed with desperate inspiration. Tonight, while they're confident and settled. A night raid, hitting their camp before they're ready. Not to win, but to hurt them badly enough that they think twice about pushing forward. Kale felt a smile tug at his lips, despite the grimness of their situation. That's suicide. So is staying here. Fair point. Kale turned back to the fires, his mind already racing through possibilities. A night attack on a superior force was the ultimate gamble. If it worked, they could cripple the Roman advance and buy precious time. If it failed, they'd be slaughtered. But then, they were going to be slaughtered anyway. At least this way, they'd choose the time and place of their death. "Gather the fighters," Kael said. "Everyone who's willing. We move in 3 hours." 3 hours? That's barely enough time to take, which is exactly why it'll work. The Romans won't expect an attack this soon. They'll be settling in, assuming we're cowering in our village, praying they show mercy. Kael's voice hardened. "We're going to teach them what happens when you underestimate desperate people." As Rian scrambled down to gather the others, Kael remained on the roof, studying the enemy fires and thinking about the arena. Every fight he'd survived there had taught him the same lesson. When you're outmatched and outgunned, your only advantage is doing what your opponent thinks is impossible. Tonight, 50 poorly trained villagers were going to attack 200 Roman soldiers in their own camp. The odds were insane. But then, the best victories always were. The moon was a sliver of silver barely visible through gathering clouds when Kael gathered his fighters in the old barn one last time. 47 men and women stood before him, their faces painted with ash and dirt to dull their skin's reflection, their weapons wrapped in cloth to prevent any telltale gleam. They looked like ghosts already, and perhaps that was fitting. Kael had sent the non-combatants away an hour earlier, watching families torn apart by necessity as children were pulled from their father's arms and elderly parents urged to move faster, despite legs that trembled with age and fear. Marin had clung to Rian until Kael himself had gently separated them, promising the girl that her brother would follow soon. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but some lies were kinder than truth. Now, looking at the assembled fighters, Kael saw the same desperate resolve he'd once seen in the faces of gladiators waiting beneath the Colosseum for their turn in the sand. That peculiar clarity that came from accepting death as inevitable and choosing to make it mean something. "You all know what we're facing," Kael began, his voice low and steady. 200 trained soldiers, maybe more. Cavalry, artillery. Everything Rome brings to bear when she wants to make an example. In a straight fight, we'd last maybe 10 minutes before being slaughtered. He let that sink in, watching faces tighten with fear that they were trying desperately to master. "So we're not going to fight straight. We're going to hit them in the dark, when they're vulnerable, when they think they're safe. We're going to set their camp on fire, kill their officers, destroy their supplies, and vanish before they can organize a response. And then, if we're very lucky and very good, some of us might actually survive until dawn." Declan shifted his weight, the big man's knuckles white on the handle of his modified sledgehammer. "And if we're not lucky, then we die knowing we made them bleed for every inch of Lusitanian soil they think they own." Kael's gray eyes swept across the group. "I won't lie to you. Most of us probably won't see sunrise, but what we do tonight will echo across this province. Every village that hears about it will know that Rome can be hurt, that resistance is possible, that courage matters more than numbers." Sarah stepped forward, her bow across her shoulders, a quiver of arrows at her hip. "You're talking about martyrdom, suicide with a purpose." "I'm talking about buying time and sending a message," Kael corrected. "The difference is that martyrs plan to die. We're planning to survive. It's just unlikely that we will." Rian moved to stand beside Kael, and the symbolic nature of the gesture wasn't lost on anyone present. The student standing with the teacher, the local rebel aligning himself with the foreign fighter who'd shown them what defiance looked like. "I've fought beside all of you these past weeks," Rian said, his voice carrying more confidence than Kael had heard from him before. "I've watched you transform from farmers into fighters, from people who were afraid into people who chose to be brave. Tonight we're going to show Rome that Lusitania isn't broken. We're going to show them that fear flows both ways." It was a good speech, Kael thought, simple, direct, hitting the emotional notes that these people needed to hear. The kid was learning. "Final preparations," Kael commanded. "Check your weapons, your gear. Pair up with your assigned partners. Remember your targets and your escape routes. When the signal comes, you move fast and you move silent. Kill anyone who gets in your way, but don't stop to fight unless you have no choice. Our goal is chaos and damage, not glory." They dispersed to make their preparations, and Kael found himself alone with Rian in the dim lamplight. "You didn't have to stay," Kael said quietly. "You're one of the few people here that Rome might actually recognize from their intelligence. They'll be looking for you specifically once this is over." "Exactly why I have to stay?" Rian checked his weapons with the methodical care Kael had drilled into him. "These people are following my lead as much as yours. If I run now, I'm telling them that leadership means sending others to die while you save yourself. My father taught me better than that. Your father was a soldier who understood the difference between courage and suicide. And he also understood that sometimes there is no difference." Rian met Kael's eyes. "You're not the only one who's made peace with dying tonight. The difference is, I'm fighting for my home." "What are you fighting for?" The question struck deeper than Kael expected. What was he fighting for? Redemption? Revenge against an empire that had stolen years of his life? Or was it something simpler and more immediate? The basic human inability to stand by while evil happened in front of him. "I don't know," Kael admitted. "Maybe I'm just tired of running." "Then tonight we stop running together." Rian offered his hand, and after a moment, Kael took it. The grip was firm, calloused from weeks of training, stronger than it had been when they'd first met. Whatever happened in the next few hours, Kael realized, this young man had been transformed by the crucible of resistance into something harder and more dangerous than the angry farm boy who'd first approached him in the village square. They gathered outside the barn as midnight approached, a silent column of determined fighters moving through the darkness like wolves on the hunt. Kael had divided them into 4 teams, each with a specific objective. Sarah and the archers would target the Roman officers and create confusion from range. Declan's group would hit the supply wagons and set fires. Rian would lead a team to free any prisoners or hostages the Romans might have taken. And Kael himself would strike at the heart of the camp, looking for the commanding officer. Cut off the head, and the body would thrash in confusion. It was brutal but effective, the same tactic that had served Rome so well in her own conquests. Kael felt no shame in stealing from his enemy's playbook. The Roman camp sprawled across a flat meadow perhaps 2 miles from Corvina, positioned with the tactical precision that spoke of experienced commanders. Sentries patrolled the perimeter at regular intervals, torches marking their positions like fireflies in the darkness. Beyond the sentries, rows of tents stood in perfect military order, with the larger command tents clustered at the center. Supply wagons formed a defensive barrier on the eastern edge, and Kael could make out the silhouettes of horses tethered in makeshift corrals. It was exactly the kind of by-the-book Roman encampment that any competent officer would establish, which meant it had exactly the kind of vulnerabilities that every by-the-book Roman camp possessed. Kael raised his hand, and his fighters froze in the tall grass 50 yards from the nearest sentry. He could see the man clearly in the torchlight, young, probably a recruit on his first real campaign, trying to look alert while fighting the natural drowsiness that came from standing watch in the small hours. The soldier's eyes scanned the darkness but saw nothing. Why would he? The rebels were supposedly cowering in their village, waiting to be crushed in the morning. The first sentry died without a sound, Sarah's arrow taking him through the throat before he could cry out. The second fell to a weighted cord wrapped around his neck by one of the fast runners, dragged back into the darkness and silenced with a blade between his ribs. The third sentry, realizing too late that something was wrong, opened his mouth to shout a warning and took an arrow through his open jaw that pinned his tongue to his palate. 3 guards down in less than 30 seconds, and the camp still slept peacefully, blissfully unaware that death was walking among them. Kael's team moved first, slipping between tents with the practiced silence of men who'd spent weeks learning to move without sound. They'd marked their faces with ash, not just for camouflage, but to identify friend from foe in the chaos to come. Any face without markings was an enemy. Any hesitation could mean death. The first Romans they encountered were sleeping, exhausted from their march and confident in their camp's security. Kael moved among them like a shadow, his blade finding hearts and throats with mechanical precision. He didn't think about the men he was killing, didn't let himself wonder if they had families waiting in Rome or lovers who would mourn them. They were obstacles to survival, nothing more. Behind him, his team followed his example, and the tents filled with the wet sounds of men dying before they could fully wake. It was butchery, not battle, murder, not combat, and it was absolutely necessary. They were halfway to the command tents when the alarm finally went up. Someone, a soldier who'd woken to relieve himself or a light sleeper disturbed by some instinct of danger, saw the bodies and started screaming, "Attack! We're under attack!" The camp exploded into chaos. Soldiers stumbled from tents half-dressed, grabbing for weapons, shouting questions into the darkness. Officers emerged bellowing orders that conflicted with each other, adding to the confusion. And in that moment of disorder, Kael's other teams struck. Fire blossomed across the supply wagons as Declan's group hurled torches soaked in oil, the flames catching and spreading with terrifying speed. Horses screamed and bolted from their corrals, adding their panic to the general chaos. Arrows began falling from the darkness like deadly rain, and every soldier who tried to organize a response found himself targeted by unseen archers. Kael pressed forward through the confusion, his team moving in the disciplined wedge formation he'd drilled into them. A Roman legionary stumbled into their path, and Kael's blade opened his stomach before the man could bring his gladius to bear. Another soldier charged from the left, and one of Kael's fighters, a former blacksmith named Marcus, caught him with a hammer strike that caved in his skull. They fought like demons, giving no quarter and expecting none, leaving a trail of bodies as they drove toward the command tent where Roman standards hung limply in the still night air. But the Romans were recovering faster than Kael had hoped. These weren't green recruits or garrison soldiers grown soft from easy postings. These were veterans, men who'd fought in a dozen provinces and survived encounters with far more organized enemies than a handful of provincial rebels. Their training kicked in, overcoming the initial shock, and suddenly Kael's team was facing organized resistance. A shield wall formed ahead of them, legionaries locking together in the defensive formation that had conquered half the world. Behind it, an officer, a tribune by the look of his armor, was shouting orders with the kind of calm authority that came from experience. "Form on me! Interlocking shields! Javelins ready!" Kael knew what was coming. The shield wall would advance while the rear ranks hurled javelins over their comrades' heads, turning his fighters into pincushions. They had perhaps 10 seconds before the formation was complete and the killing began in earnest. "Break left," Kael commanded, abandoning the direct approach. "Through the tents!" His team scattered, diving between canvas structures just as the first javelins whistled through the air where they'd been standing. Kael felt one graze his shoulder, tearing cloth and skin, but he ignored the pain and kept moving. The tents provided momentary cover but also confusion. In the darkness and smoke, it was impossible to tell friend from foe until you were close enough to see their faces. Kael nearly killed one of his own men before recognizing the ash markings, and twice he had to dodge attacks from Romans who appeared suddenly from the smoke like vengeful ghosts. A legionary burst from a tent directly in front of him, gladius already thrusting toward Kael's midsection. Kael twisted, feeling the blade slice across his ribs, and brought his own sword down in a diagonal strike that caught the Roman at the junction of neck and shoulder. The man went down in a spray of arterial blood, and Kael leaped over his falling body without breaking stride. He could hear fighting all around him now, the clash of steel, the screams of wounded men, the roar of flames consuming the supply wagons. His plan was working, but it was also falling apart. Too many Romans, too organized, rallying too quickly. What should have been a devastating hit and run was turning into a pitched battle they couldn't win. A horn blast cut through the chaos, and Kael's blood ran cold. That was the signal for cavalry deployment. If the Roman horsemen formed up and charged, his scattered fighters would be ridden down and slaughtered. "Fall back!" Kael shouted, his voice carrying over the din. "All teams, execute retreat pattern Gamma!" It was one of the withdrawal strategies he'd drilled into them, a staged fighting retreat using terrain and obstacles to slow pursuit while the main force escaped. In theory, it should work. In practice, getting panicked fighters to execute complex maneuvers while under attack was nearly impossible. But to his surprise and pride, his people responded. He saw teams breaking contact and withdrawing toward their designated rally points, covering each other's retreat with disciplined precision that would have impressed any professional soldier. Declan's group laid down one last volley of arrows before disappearing into the smoke. The fast runners were already gone, melting into the darkness like they'd been trained. Kael and his team were the last to withdraw, fighting a running battle against Romans who pressed them hard. Marcus took a javelin through the thigh and went down screaming, Kale made a split-second decision. Trying to save him would get them all killed. He locked eyes with Marcus, saw understanding and forgiveness there, and kept running. The blacksmith's screams followed them into the darkness, abruptly cut short. They hit the tree line at a dead sprint, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches. Behind them, the Roman camp was a vision of chaos. Flames reaching toward the sky, men shouting conflicting orders, the screams of wounded and dying mixing with the panicked neighing of horses. Kyle didn't slow down until they'd put a mile between themselves and the camp, finally collapsing in a ravine that offered cover from pursuit. His team gathered around him, faces streaked with soot and blood, chests heaving from exertion and fear. "Sound off," Kyle commanded between gasps for air. "Who made it?" The count came back grim. Of the 12 fighters who'd gone in with him, only 7 had made it out. 5 dead or captured, including Marcus and a young farmer named Tomas, who'd been just 19 years old. The other teams trickled in over the next hour, each with their own losses. Sarah's archers had lost 3 to Roman javelins. Declan's group was down 4, though Declan himself had survived with only minor wounds. Rian's team had taken the heaviest casualties. 6 dead, including 2 who'd been cut down trying to free prisoners that turned out not to exist. When the final count was tallied, 21 fighters had failed to return. Nearly half their force, gone in a single night's desperate gamble. Kyle felt the weight of those deaths settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. 21 people who'd trusted him, who'd believed his plan would work, who'd died because he'd convinced them that attacking a superior force was their best chance at survival. But as dawn began to paint the eastern sky with pale light, and they could look back toward the Roman camp, Kale saw that their sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The camp was devastated. Smoke still rose from burned supply wagons, and even from this distance, they could see the Romans scrambling to organize their remaining resources. The neat military precision was gone, replaced by the chaos of an army that had been bloodied and wasn't sure what to do next. More importantly, they weren't advancing on Corvina. They were focused on tending their wounded, salvaging their supplies, and securing their perimeter against further attacks. Rian appeared at Kyle's side, his face grim beneath the ash and blood. "We lost too many." "We did," Kyle agreed, not trying to soften the truth. "But we also bought time. The evacuees should be deep in the wilderness by now, beyond Roman reach. And we proved that Rome isn't invincible. At the cost of 21 lives." "Yes." Kale turned to face the younger man. "That's what resistance costs. That's what I tried to tell you back in the village, before any of this started. Victory isn't glorious or clean, it's bloody and expensive, and it breaks something inside everyone who survives it." Rian was quiet for a long moment, staring at the distant camp. Then he said, "We need to keep moving. They'll send scouts once they've organized, and if they catch us in the open—" He was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. The remaining fighters scrambled for weapons, forming a defensive circle, but Kyle raised a hand to stop them. "Wait, that's not a Roman formation." The riders emerged from the tree line moments later, a dozen mounted men, well-armed but not in Roman equipment. Their leader was a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his left cheek and eyes that had seen too much violence to be surprised by anything. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot and approached Kyle with obvious caution. "You're the one they're calling the Shadow of the Sands," the man said in heavily accented Latin. "The gladiator who's teaching farmers to fight Rome." "I'm Kyle Varro," Kale confirmed, his hand resting on his gladius. "Who's asking?" "Name's Brennus. I lead a group of, let's call them free traders. We operate in the hills, mostly staying clear of Roman attention." The scarred man gestured toward the distant camp. "Word is you just hit a full cohort with a handful of villagers and lived to tell about it." "Word travels fast." "Word about crazy bastards attacking Rome travels very fast," Brennus corrected with a grim smile. "We've been watching you, watching what you're building in Corvina. Some of my people think you're insane. Others think you might actually have a chance." "What do you think?" Brennus studied Kyle for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. "I think you're probably insane. But I also think Rome needs to be reminded that Lusitania isn't theirs to do with as they please. And I think that if you're going to keep poking the empire with a stick, you're going to need more than farmers with pitchforks." He gestured to his men, and Kale saw the weapons they carried. Real swords, not farming implements. Composite bows that could punch through armor. Even a few pieces of Roman military equipment that had clearly been acquired through less than legal means. "You're offering to join us?" Kale asked carefully. "I'm offering to not sit on the sidelines while someone finally has the courage to fight back," Brennus corrected. "We know these hills better than any Roman scout. We know where to hide, where to run, how to survive when the Empire comes hunting, and we know how to hurt them where they're weak." It was exactly what Kyle needed. Experienced fighters who understood guerrilla warfare, who could teach his villagers the skills that would keep them alive in the long resistance that was coming. But it also meant expanding his small rebellion into something larger, something that Rome would have no choice but to respond to with overwhelming force. Once he accepted this offer, there would be no going back. No more pretending this was just a local dispute that might be forgotten if everyone kept their heads down. This would be war, real and undeniable. Kyle looked at his surviving fighters, exhausted, bloodied, but still standing. Looked at Rian, who met his gaze with steady determination. Looked at the smoke rising from the Roman camp, evidence of what desperate people could accomplish when they stopped accepting oppression as inevitable. "We're heading to the old watchtower at Raven's Peak," Kyle said finally. "It's defensible, off the main roads, and has water. If you and your people can meet us there by tomorrow, we'll talk about what comes next." Brennus's scarred face split into a savage grin. "Tomorrow, then. And Varro? For what it's worth, what you did tonight, that took more balls than brains, but sometimes that's exactly what's needed." He mounted his horse and rode off with his men, leaving Kyle's group alone in the growing light of dawn. "Did we just start a war?" Rian asked quietly. "No," Kale said, already calculating routes and resources in his mind. "Rome started this war when they decided Lusitania existed only to serve their pleasure. We're just the first ones stupid enough to fight back." As they began the long trek to Raven's Peak, leaving behind the smoking ruins of the Roman camp and the graves of their fallen comrades, Kyle felt the weight of what they'd set in motion. This wasn't about one village anymore. It wasn't even about stopping a single recruitment order. This was about whether people would accept tyranny as the natural order of things, or whether they'd risk everything for the chance to live free. The path ahead was dark and bloody and likely ended in death for most of them. But it was a path they'd chosen, and that choice mattered more than the outcome. Behind them, in the Roman camp, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. Tribune Gaius Marcellus stood amid the wreckage of his supplies, surveying the damage with a mixture of fury and grudging respect. Whoever had led this attack understood warfare at a level that belied their supposed provincial origins. His Optio approached with the casualty reports, and the numbers made Gaius's jaw tighten. 43 dead, 62 wounded seriously enough to be combat ineffective. Nearly half his force, devastated in a single night by an enemy he'd been told was poorly armed and untrained. "Orders, sir?" the Optio asked, his voice carefully neutral. Gaius looked toward the hills where the attackers had vanished, then back at his devastated camp. Every tactical instinct he possessed screamed for immediate pursuit and total annihilation of the rebels. But his practical experience whispered that chasing guerrilla fighters into terrain they knew better than he did was a recipe for more casualties. "We hold position," he said finally. "Tend the wounded, salvage what we can, send riders to the garrison for reinforcements and supplies. And find out everything you can about this Kyle Varro, who he is, where he came from, what makes him think he can defeat Rome." "And the village, sir? Corvina?" Gaius was silent for a long moment. Standard procedure said to burn it to the ground, crucify any fighting-age males, and sell the rest into slavery. Make an example that would terrify every other settlement in the province into compliance. But looking at the destruction around him, Gaius suspected that the standard approach wasn't going to work this time. These people weren't afraid anymore, and fear was the foundation of Roman provincial control. Take that away, and you were left with nothing but raw force, which was expensive, brutal, and often counterproductive. "Leave it for now," he said. "Let them think they've won. Let other villages hear about their victory and start getting ideas. And when we return, and we will return, We'll have enough force to crush not just Corvina, but every settlement that dared to think resistance was possible. We'll make such an example that Lusitania will remember Roman power for 1,000 years. It was a patient approach, one that required swallowing his pride and accepting that immediate vengeance was less important than ultimate victory. But Gaius hadn't survived 20 years in the legions by being impulsive. He would wait. He would gather his strength. And when the time was right, he would show these rebels exactly what happened to those who defied Rome. In the hills above the camp, Cael felt a chill run down his spine despite the warming morning air. He couldn't see the Roman commander or hear his words, but some instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 17 arena fights, told him that the worst was yet to come. The Romans weren't retreating in defeat. They were regrouping for a larger assault, and when it came, it would be devastating. But that was a problem for another day. For now, they had survivors to protect, wounded to tend, and allies to meet. The resistance that had begun with one man stopping a patrol in a village square had grown into something larger than Cael had ever imagined. Whether that was a triumph or a tragedy remained to be seen. But one thing was certain, Lusitania would never be the same again, and neither would the man who taught its people that courage could stand against empire. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, and Cael led his battered fighters toward an uncertain future, carrying the memory of the fallen and the hope that their sacrifice had meant something. In the distance, Raven's Peak waited like a promise or a threat, and the long road of resistance stretched out before them into the unknown. Raven's Peak rose from the surrounding hills like a broken tooth, its ancient watchtower crumbling but still defiant against the sky. The structure had been built generations ago by people whose names were long forgotten, meant to guard against threats that no longer existed. Now it would serve a new purpose, sheltering rebels who dared to bloody Rome's nose and lived to face the consequences. Cael's group reached the base of the peak as the sun climbed toward noon, exhausted and haunted by the night's violence. They'd lost people during the retreat, 2 more fighters who'd succumbed to their wounds during the march, dying quietly while their companions struggled to keep moving. The bodies had been left in shallow graves marked only by stones, with promises to return when it was safe to give them proper farewells. Ryan had taken the deaths hard, his face drawn and pale as he helped carry the wounded up the steep path to the tower. Cael watched him struggle with the weight of command, knowing there were no words that would make it easier. Leadership meant carrying the dead with you, and the only thing that separated good leaders from broken ones was whether you let that weight crush you or temper you into something harder. The watchtower itself was in better condition than Cael had hoped. 3 walls still stood mostly intact, providing shelter from wind and observation. A natural spring bubbled up from rocks nearby, ensuring fresh water, and the approach was steep enough that any attacking force would be visible long before they reached the summit, giving defenders precious time to prepare. Brennus and his riders arrived as promised, bringing not just fighters but supplies, dried meat, grain, medical supplies that looked suspiciously like Roman military issue. The scarred leader dismounted and surveyed their position with an experienced eye. "Defensible," he said approvingly. "Can't hold against a determined siege, but for a temporary camp, could be worse. Your people look like they've been through hell." "We have," Cael said simply. "How many fighters can you bring to this?" 30, maybe 35 if I call in all the scattered groups. Mix of deserters, bandits, and people who found Roman law inconvenient. Brennus pulled a water skin from his saddle and took a long drink. Not exactly professional soldiers, but they know how to fight dirty and survive, which seems to be your specialty too. Cael nodded, doing the mathematics in his head. 26 survivors from the village attack, plus Brennus's 35, gave them 61 fighters total. Against what would inevitably be a Roman response measured in hundreds, if not thousands, it was laughable. But then, the raid last night had been laughable too, and they'd made it work. "We need to talk strategy," Cael said. "Come." They gathered in the partial shelter of the tower, Cael, Brennus, Ryan, Declan, and Sarah. The core leadership of something that didn't yet have a name but was rapidly taking the shape of organized resistance. Brennus spread a crude map on a flat stone, pointing to various locations marked in charcoal. "These are the Roman positions we know about. Main garrison here at Portus Magnus, about 3 days' march from Corvina. Smaller outposts here, here, and here. Supply routes running along the old trade roads. Standard occupation setup, enough force to intimidate, but spread thin enough that they're vulnerable to coordinated attacks. How spread thin? Rian asked, leaning over the map with intense focus. Each outpost has maybe 20 to 30 soldiers. The garrison at Portus Magnus has about 300, but half of those are administrative personnel, not frontline fighters. Brennus traced a finger along the supply routes. They rely on intimidation and the belief that resistance is futile. Take that belief away and their actual combat strength is less impressive. Kale studied the map, his mind automatically running tactical scenarios. The raid last night proved we can hurt them, but it also proved they'll regroup and come back harder. We need to stay mobile, hit them where they're weak, and disappear before they can bring superior numbers to bear. Guerrilla warfare, Sarah said quietly. Like the stories my grandfather told about the border wars. Never hold ground, never give them a target, just bleed them slowly until they decide the cost isn't worth it. Exactly. Kyle looked up at the assembled faces. But understand what that means. No more standing battles, no more defending villages. We become ghosts. Strike, fade, strike again. It means leaving behind everything familiar and living rough. It means watching Roman patrols burn settlements in retaliation and not being able to stop them, because stopping them means death. The silence that followed was heavy with the implications. Rian broke it first. The people we evacuated from Corvina, he said slowly. They can't go back, can they? Even if the Romans don't torch the village, returning means accepting whatever punishment Rome decides to levy. They're refugees now. We're all refugees, Brennus said bluntly. Every man, woman, and child who's thrown their lot in with this resistance. Rome doesn't forgive rebellion, and she doesn't forget. The moment you raised your hand against the empire, you signed away any chance of returning to normal life. Declan shifted his considerable weight, his scarred knuckles flexing unconsciously. So what's the end game? We can't fight forever. Eventually they'll bring enough soldiers that even guerrilla tactics won't save us. It was the question Kyle had been avoiding because the honest answer was one that would break morale before they'd even begun. But these people deserve truth, not comfortable lies. There is no endgame, Kyle said flatly. Not one where we win in any conventional sense. Rome controls half the known world. She has legions numbered in the tens of thousands, resources beyond counting, and centuries of experience crushing rebellions. We can hurt her, embarrass her, make this province too expensive to hold comfortably, but we can't defeat her. Then why fight? Rian's voice carried a note of betrayal. If we can't win, I said we can't defeat Rome, Kyle interrupted. I didn't say we can't win. Winning doesn't always mean destroying your enemy. Sometimes it means making them decide you're not worth the effort. Sometimes it means surviving long enough that circumstances change. And sometimes it just means living free for however long you have left, instead of dying on your knees. He let that settle before continuing. The goal isn't to conquer Rome. It's to make Lusitania ungovernable, make every patrol an invitation to ambush, make every tax collector a potential casualty, make every Roman official wake up wondering if today's the day they don't make it home. Do that consistently enough. And eventually the Senate starts asking whether this province generates more revenue than it costs to hold. You're talking about a campaign that could take years, Sarah observed, maybe decades. I'm talking about changing how people think, Kyle corrected. Right now, across this province, villagers see Roman soldiers and immediately calculate how to appease them. They see rebellion as suicide. We need to flip that. Make resistance seem possible, even preferable to submission, and the only way to do that is through example. Brennus was nodding slowly, a savage grin spreading across his scarred face. Hit them where it hurts. Make them bleed in ways that can't be hidden. Force them to overreact, which makes more people hate them, which creates more rebels. Spiral of violence that eventually becomes unsustainable. It's not glorious, Kyle warned. It's not heroic battles and victory parades. It's ambushes in the dark, burned supply depots, murdered tax collectors. It's dirty, brutal work that will make you question whether you're still the good ones. But it's the only way people like us can fight people like them. The group was quiet, each person wrestling with the reality of what Kyle was proposing. This wasn't a quick rebellion that would succeed or fail within a season. This was committing to a way of life, or death, that might never see resolution in their lifetimes. Finally, Ryan spoke. The people from Corvina who evacuated, the families, the children, they need somewhere safe while we fight this war, somewhere Rome won't find them. There are valleys deeper in the mountains, Brennus said, old settlements that were abandoned when Rome first came. My people use them sometimes when we need to disappear. Not comfortable, but safe enough if you know how to hide your tracks. Then that's where they go, Kyle decided. We establish a safe haven for non-combatants. Meanwhile, everyone here becomes a fighter, no exceptions. I don't care if you were a baker or a weaver before. If you're staying with this resistance, you learn to kill Romans. Over the next 3 days, Raven's Peak transformed from a ruin into a military camp. Brennus's people brought expertise that Kyle's villagers lacked. How to set snares that could cripple horses, how to make poisons from common plants, how to read Roman patrol patterns and exploit their predictability. In return, Kyle drilled them all in the disciplined tactics he'd learned in the arena and refined during the village defense. The training was brutal. Kyle pushed them through combat drills until their hands bled, made them practice night movement until they could navigate pitch darkness without sound, forced them to rehearse ambush scenarios until the motions became instinctive. He was harsh and unforgiving because kindness in training meant death in combat. Ryan proved to be a natural leader, able to translate Kyle's sometimes cryptic instructions into terms the others could understand. He worked alongside the newest recruits, demonstrating techniques rather than just ordering them performed, and the respect he earned was genuine rather than forced. Sarah organized the archers into a deadly effective unit, teaching them to shoot in coordinated volleys that could saturate an area with arrows. Declan became the master of ambush tactics, using his strength and surprising stealth to demonstrate how to disable armored opponents. And through it all, scouts came and went with reports of Roman movements. The garrison at Portus Magnus was being reinforced. Patrols had increased in frequency and size. Tribune Marcellus had put a bounty on Kyle's head that had tripled overnight. 30,000 denarii for the Shadow of the Sands, dead or alive. It was a staggering sum, enough to make every mercenary and bounty hunter in Lusitania take notice. Kyle knew it was only a matter of time before someone tried to collect. The attempt came on the 4th night. Kyle was sleeping lightly, as had become his habit, when some instinct pulled him fully awake. The camp was quiet, the sentries visible at their posts, nothing obviously wrong. But something felt off, a wrongness in the air that set his combat instincts screaming. He rolled from his bedroll just as a blade struck where his head had been moments before, burying itself in the packed earth. Kyle came up with his gladius already in hand, facing a figure in dark clothing whose face was hidden behind a black cloth. An assassin. Professional, judging by the silent approach and precise strike. Sent by Rome or hired by someone looking to collect the bounty, it didn't matter. The intent was the same. They circled each other in the darkness, both moving with the careful precision of trained killers. The assassin struck first, a lightning-fast combination of strikes aimed at vital points. Kyle deflected, countered, felt his blade turned aside by hidden armor beneath the dark clothing. This wasn't some Roman soldier. This was someone who killed for a living, someone whose skills matched or possibly exceeded Kyle's own. The fight moved through the camp, their blades whispering in the darkness. Kyle felt cuts opening on his arms, his shoulder, knew he was giving as good as he got, but also knew that time favored his opponent. The assassin only needed one good strike. Kyle needed to survive until help arrived. A shout went up as sentries finally noticed the combat. Torches flared to life, and in the sudden illumination, Kyle saw his attacker clearly for the first time. She was tall, lean, with the efficient musculature of someone who'd spent years honing their body into a weapon. Her face, now visible as the cloth had fallen away during the fight, was marked with scars that spoke of a hard life. But it was her eyes that caught Kyle's attention. Cold, professional, utterly devoid of mercy or hesitation. She saw the reinforcements coming and made a split-second decision. Instead of pressing her attack, she threw a small clay sphere at the ground between them. It shattered, releasing a cloud of acrid smoke that made Kyle eyes water and his throat close. By the time the smoke cleared, she was gone, vanished into the darkness with the same supernatural silence she'd arrived with. Rian arrived with a dozen fighters, weapons ready, finding Kyle standing amid the dissipating smoke with blood dripping from multiple wounds.
"What in the hells was that?" Ryan demanded, his eyes scanning the darkness for threats. "A reminder," Kyle said, pressing a hand to the deepest cut on his shoulder, "that Rome has more than one way to fight, and that we're not the only ones who can strike from shadows." The assassin's attack changed the dynamic in the camp. If one professional killer had found them, others would follow. The 30,000 denarii bounty was too tempting for the kind of people who traded in death. Kyle doubled the sentries and instituted new security protocols. No one slept in the same place twice. Passwords changed daily. Anyone approaching the camp was treated as hostile until proven otherwise. It made life harder, but it kept them alive. Meanwhile, Kyle began planning their next operation. If they were going to build a resistance movement, they needed to make a statement that would resonate across the province. The raid on the military camp had hurt Rome's pride, but it hadn't touched her coin, and Rome cared more about money than dignity. "The tax convoy," Brennus suggested during a planning session. "Every month, collectors gather tribute from a dozen villages and transport it to Portus Magnus, usually about 40 wagons, protected by maybe 50 soldiers. If we could hit that, we'd be stealing directly from the imperial treasury," Kale finished, "making Rome bleed gold instead of just blood, and we'd have resources to sustain the resistance longer." "It's also heavily guarded," Sarah pointed out. 50 soldiers, open terrain for most of the route. We'd be spotted long before we could set up an ambush." "Unless we don't ambush them on the route," Rian said slowly, his finger tracing the road on their map. "What if we let them think they're safe until they're not? Hit them at a way station or during a river crossing where terrain limits their movement." Kale studied the younger man with growing respect. Rian was developing the kind of tactical thinking that couldn't be taught, only cultivated through experience and natural aptitude. "The Serpent's Crossing," Kyle said, pointing to a spot on the map where the road forded a river. "Narrow approach, steep banks on both sides. If we position archers on the heights and block the ford with obstacles, we could bottle them up long enough to do serious damage." "And escape before reinforcements arrive?" Declan asked. "The beauty of hitting a tax convoy is that it's carrying wealth, not messages," Brennus said with a predatory grin. "By the time Rome realizes something's wrong, we'll be long gone and their gold will be funding our resistance." They spent the next 2 days planning every detail. Scout reports confirmed the convoy's schedule and route. Brennus's people identified escape paths through terrain too rough for cavalry pursuit. Kale drilled teams on their specific roles until everyone could execute their part blindfolded. The night before the operation, Kyle found himself unable to sleep, standing watch at the edge of the camp and staring out at the dark landscape. How many times had he done this in the arena? Stood on the edge of violence, knowing that tomorrow might be his last day, trying to make peace with mortality. Couldn't sleep either? He turned to find Ryan approaching, carrying 2 cups of the bitter tea that Sarah brewed from mountain herbs. "Thinking about tomorrow," Kyle admitted, accepting the offered cup. "Worried it won't work?" "Worried it will." Kale sipped the tea, grimacing at its harshness. "Every success makes the next target bigger, the stakes higher. We take this tax convoy, Rome won't just send another patrol. She'll send a cohort, maybe a full legion. And then we're not fighting for survival. We're fighting to see how many Romans we can take down before they crush us." Rian was quiet for a moment, processing this. "You think we're going to lose, in the end?" "I think Rome has been toppling kingdoms and crushing rebellions for 500 years. I think she has resources and experience that make our resistance look like children throwing stones at a fortress." Kyle met the younger man's eyes. "But I also think that sometimes the stones find cracks. Sometimes the fortress isn't as solid as it looks. And sometimes, even when you know you're going to lose, you fight anyway because the alternative is worse." "My father would have liked you," Rian said quietly. "He used to say that courage isn't about winning. It's about standing up even when you know you'll fall." "Smart man." "He was," right up until the fever took him. Rian stared into his tea. I wonder what he'd think of all this. His son leading a rebellion, fighting Rome, probably going to die young and bloody. I think, Kyle said carefully, he'd be proud that you chose to stand rather than kneel, that when Rome came to take what wasn't hers, you said no. That matters more than the outcome. They stood in comfortable silence, two men on the edge of violence, finding what peace they could in the quiet hours before dawn. The Serpent's Crossing lived up to its name. The river wound through a narrow gorge, the ford itself barely wide enough for 2 wagons abreast, with steep rocky slopes rising on either side. It was a natural bottleneck, the kind of terrain that made generals nervous and ambushers smile. Kyle's forces were in position hours before the convoy arrived, archers hidden among the rocks on both slopes, their arrows pre-positioned for quick successive volleys. Heavy ropes stretched across the ford beneath the water's surface, ready to be raised to tangle wagon wheels. Fighters concealed in the brush on the far side, prepared to strike the rear of the column while the front was trapped. And Kyle himself, positioned at the ford's narrowest point with a select team of the best fighters, ready to strike directly at the convoy's heart. The tax collectors arrived at mid-morning, their wagons creaking under the weight of Lusitania's tribute to Rome. Kale counted 43 wagons, each loaded with coins, precious metals, goods confiscated from people who could barely afford to eat. The guards numbered closer to 60 than 50, but they were relaxed, confident in their numbers and the routine nature of the journey. That confidence would be their undoing. The convoy began crossing the ford, wagons splashing through the shallow water, guards maintaining a loose perimeter. They were halfway across when Kyle gave the signal. The ropes beneath the water snapped taut, raised by teams on either bank. Wagon wheels caught and tangled, horses screamed and reared, and the entire column ground to a confused halt. Then the arrows began to fall. Sarah's archers had been practicing volleys for weeks, and their training showed. Arrows fell like deadly rain, targeting the guards with precision. Men dropped, clutching at shafts protruding from necks and chests and faces. The survivors tried to form defensive positions, but the terrain was wrong, too narrow, too confined, no room to maneuver. Kale's team struck from the front while Brennus's fighters hit the rear, catching the convoy in a brutal pincer. The fighting was close and vicious, Romans struggling to use their training in terrain that negated their advantages. A tax collector tried to run and took an arrow through the spine. A guard captain rallied his men only to have Declan's hammer crush his skull. It was over in less than 10 minutes. 60 Roman guards dead or dying. The tax collectors surrendered and bound, 43 wagons of Rome's wealth sitting in the ford for the taking. Kale walked among the carnage, checking for survivors who might need mercy or captives who might have useful information. One guard, gut shot and bleeding out, grabbed his ankle. "You're dead!" the Roman gasped through bloody teeth. "All of you! Rome will burn this entire province to ashes before she lets rebels steal from her." "Then she'll burn ashes," Kyle said quietly, and moved on. They took 20 of the wagons, as much as they could transport quickly, and burned the rest. The tax collectors they released with a message. Tell Rome that Lusitania's tribute will no longer flow freely. Tell her that every coin she takes will be paid for in blood. As they withdrew into the hills with their captured wealth, Kyle felt no triumph, only grim satisfaction. They'd struck a real blow against Rome's coffers, funded their resistance for months to come, and proven again that the empire could be hurt. But as he looked back at the smoke rising from burning wagons and the corpses floating in the ford, he knew they'd also guaranteed that Rome's response would be terrible and absolute. The war they'd started was about to become very real. That night, they celebrated in their hidden valley camp, distributing some of the captured coins among the fighters while setting the rest aside for supplies and weapons. There was drinking, laughter, the kind of release that came from surviving impossible odds. But Kyle noticed Rian standing apart from the celebration, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "You killed your first man today," Kyle said, approaching quietly. It wasn't a question. He'd seen Ryan drive a blade into a Roman guard's chest during the ambush. 3 men, Rian corrected, his voice hollow. 3 men who were just doing their job, following orders. One of them had a letter in his pocket from his wife. I found it when we were searching the bodies. And now you're wondering if that makes you a murderer. Doesn't it? Rian looked up, his eyes haunted. They weren't monsters. They were just soldiers. Some of them were probably conscripts who never wanted to be here. And I killed them for carrying other people's money. Kael sat beside him, close enough for conversation, but giving him space. You want absolution, I can't give it. You want me to tell you they deserved it. That would be a lie. The truth is messier. Those men were part of a system that takes and takes until there's nothing left. They wore the armor and carried the swords that enforce Roman will. Maybe they were good men individually, but collectively they were the tools of oppression. That's a rationalization? Yes, Kael agreed. It is. Because the alternative is accepting that we're no better than them, that we kill for our cause just like they kill for theirs, and the only difference is which side we're on. That's a truth that breaks some people. Did it break you? In the arena? Kael thought about the 17 men he'd killed for entertainment, their faces still clear in his memory after all these years. It bent me, shaped me into something different than I was. But it didn't break me because I held on to one truth. I killed to survive, and survival mattered. Here, now, you killed for the same reason. Not just your survival, but the survival of everyone Rome would have bled dry with those taxes. How do you live with it? You carry it, Kael said simply. Every death, every face, every moment of doubt. You carry it and you keep moving forward because stopping means letting it consume you. And you remember that the people you killed had a choice. They chose to serve Rome, to enforce her will, to be part of the machinery of conquest. You didn't force them to be there. You just refused to let them do it unopposed. Rian nodded slowly, something settling in his expression. Not peace. He'd never have peace with what he'd done. But acceptance. The beginning of the hardness that would let him continue this fight without being destroyed by it. Tomorrow we move deeper into the mountains, Kael said, standing and offering Rian his hand. There's a report of Roman scouts getting too close to our safe haven. We need to make sure they don't find the families. I'll be ready, Rian said, taking the offered hand and pulling himself up. As he walked away to join the others, Kael watched him go and felt something unexpected. Hope. Not hope that they would win. The odds against that were astronomical. But hope that maybe, just maybe, they were building something that would outlast them. A legacy of resistance that would teach future generations that submission wasn't inevitable. That even against empire, even facing certain death, some people would always choose to stand. And in the dark times ahead, when Rome brought all her fury to bear on this small rebellion, that choice would matter more than any victory ever could. The Roman response to the tax convoy massacre came swifter and more brutal than even Kael had anticipated. Within a week, Tribune Marcellus had mobilized not just his cohort, but called in reinforcements from neighboring provinces, over 800 soldiers, supported by cavalry units, and even a detachment of auxiliary archers from Syria who were renowned for their deadly accuracy. The news reached Kael's camp through scouts who'd barely escaped with their lives, bringing reports that turned the blood cold. Marcellus wasn't simply hunting the rebels. He was implementing a strategy of total devastation, burning any settlement suspected of harboring sympathizers, executing village elders who couldn't or wouldn't provide information about the resistance's whereabouts. Corvina had been razed to the ground, every building reduced to ash, every field salted so nothing would grow. The few villagers who'd remained behind were crucified along the main road as a warning to others, their bodies left to rot in public view. When Rian heard the news, something inside him shattered visibly. Kael watched the young man's face cycle through shock, grief, and finally harden into something colder and more dangerous than anger. They're making examples, Rian said, his voice eerily calm, trying to terrorize the province into betraying us. It's working, Brennus reported grimly. 3 villages have already sent delegations to Portus Magnus, swearing loyalty and offering tribute in exchange for protection. People are scared, Kael, more scared of us than of Rome. The resistance fighters had gathered in the main cavern of their mountain refuge, faces illuminated by torchlight, and Kael could see the doubt creeping into their expressions. They'd known Rome would retaliate, but the scale of it, the sheer merciless efficiency of Marcellus's campaign, was shaking their resolve.
So we're causing more harm than good, Sarah said quietly. Our resistance is getting innocent people killed. Rome is getting innocent people killed, Kael corrected sharply. We didn't crucify those villagers. We didn't burn Corvina. Marcellus did that, and he did it because terror is Rome's answer to anything that threatens her control. Blaming ourselves for their brutality is exactly what they want. But if we stopped, a young fighter named Lucas ventured, if we surrendered, maybe they'd execute every one of us as traitors and continue bleeding this province dry, Kyle interrupted. Rome doesn't forgive rebellion. She destroys it so thoroughly that no one dares try again for generations. Surrendering now just means we die for nothing. The cavern fell silent, the weight of their impossible situation pressing down on everyone. They couldn't surrender, couldn't win a direct confrontation, and couldn't keep fighting without causing more civilian casualties. It was Ryan who broke the silence with words that would change everything. Then we changed the game entirely, he said, his voice carrying a conviction that made everyone look at him. We stopped trying to win through violence and start winning through symbols. We make ourselves into something bigger than just rebels. We become proof that Rome isn't invincible. Explain, Kael said, intrigued despite himself. Rian moved to the map they'd drawn on the cavern wall, pointing to Portus Magnus. Marcellus thinks he's hunting bandits and criminals. Let's show him, and everyone watching, that he's fighting something different. Something that represents Lusitanian pride and freedom. We need a victory so visible, so impossible to ignore, that it changes how people think about resisting Rome. You're talking about attacking Portus Magnus, Declan said, his eyes widening. That's suicide. The garrison alone has 300 soldiers, plus whatever reinforcements Marcellus brought. I'm talking about embarrassing Rome so badly that Marcellus's superiors start asking questions about his competence, Ryan countered. We can't destroy the garrison. But what if we could infiltrate it, steal something precious, make them look foolish in front of the entire province? Kyle felt a dangerous spark of interest. The idea was insane, but insanity had served them well so far. The imperial standards, Brennus said suddenly, understanding dawning on his scarred face. Every garrison displays the emperor's personal standard and their legion's eagle. If we could steal those, we'd be stealing Rome's honor, Kael finished. Every soldier who saw empty standard poles would know their garrison had been violated. Every civilian would know Rome could be humiliated. It wouldn't win us the war, but it might win us something more valuable: belief. The planning took 3 days of intense preparation. Scouts mapped the garrison's layout, identified patrol patterns, located the standard room where the precious symbols of Roman authority were kept under guard. Brennus's people procured Roman uniforms and forged documents that would allow them to pose as a supply detail. Sarah drilled a small team on moving silently through confined spaces. And Kael, drawing on memories of Roman military procedure from his arena days, crafted a plan that was simultaneously brilliant and suicidal. They would walk into Portus Magnus in broad daylight, pretending to be Roman soldiers transporting special provisions for Tribune Marcellus. Once inside, a small team would split off to steal the standards while the rest created a diversion. They'd escape in the chaos, disappearing into the civilian crowds before the garrison could organize pursuit. It required perfect timing, flawless execution, and extraordinary luck. The margin for error was non-existent. I'm going, Rian announced when Kael began selecting the infiltration team. No, you're too recognizable. Marcellus has your description, probably sketches by now. Which is exactly why I need to be there. Ryan's jaw was set with familiar, stubborn determination. This was my plan. If it fails, I should be the one who pays the price, not someone else. Kael wanted to argue, to protect this young man who'd become something like a brother over these brutal weeks. But he recognized the look in Rian's eyes, the same look he'd seen in arena fighters who knew they were walking into their last battle and wanted to face it on their own terms. Fine, Kael said. But you follow my orders exactly. No heroics, no improvisation. We get in, get the standards, get out. Understood? Understood. They left for Portus Magnus before dawn, a column of 10 fighters dressed in Roman uniforms that fit poorly but well enough to pass casual inspection. The forged documents identified them as a supply detail from the eastern garrison, bringing special wine and provisions requisitioned by Tribune Marcellus for his campaign. The journey took 2 days, during which Cale drilled them relentlessly on Roman military protocol: how to salute, how to address superior officers, the proper responses to challenges. Any mistake could expose them, and exposure meant death. Portus Magnus rose from the coastal plain like a stone giant, its walls 20 feet high and studded with watchtowers. The garrison itself sprawled behind those walls. Barracks, training grounds, administrative buildings, all laid out with the geometric precision that Romans brought to everything they built. They approached the main gate at mid-morning, when traffic was heaviest and guards were most likely to wave through routine deliveries. Cale, wearing the uniform of a Roman optio, presented their forged documents to the gate commander with practiced boredom. "Supply detail from the eastern garrison," he said in fluent Latin, his accent perfectly matching the regional dialect. Tribune Marcellus requested these provisions for his campaign headquarters. The gate commander barely glanced at the documents before waving them through. "Deliver to the quartermaster's depot, eastern quadrant, and tell Marcellus his wine better arrive intact this time. Last shipment was half vinegar." "Will do," Cale said, and just like that, they were inside. The garrison was organized chaos. Soldiers drilling in the training yard, civilians conducting business at the market stalls that had sprung up to serve the military population, officials moving between buildings with scrolls and tablets. Cale's team blended into the flow, just another supply detail among dozens. They split up as planned. Cale, Ryan, and 2 others headed toward the Principia, the headquarters building where the standards were kept. The rest continued to the quartermaster's depot to maintain the cover story and prepare the diversion. The Principia was guarded, but not heavily. 2 sentries at the main entrance, looking bored and probably counting the hours until their shift ended. Cale approached with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. "We're here to inventory the standard room," he announced, showing documents that identified him as part of an administrative audit team. It was a gamble. Such audits were rare, but not unheard of, and the documents looked official enough to pass scrutiny. The sentries exchanged glances. "Nobody told us about an audit." "Nobody tells you anything," Cale said with the casual contempt of a career soldier addressing lower ranks. "You want to explain to Tribune Marcellus why his audit was delayed because 2 gate guards decided protocol didn't apply to them?" The magic words, Tribune Marcellus, worked perfectly. The sentries stepped aside, and Cale's team entered the Principia. The standard room was on the 2nd floor, a sanctified space where the legion's most precious symbols were kept. The door was locked, but Brennus had taught them how to pick Roman locks, and within moments they were inside. The standard stood in iron holders, magnificent and terrible, the golden eagle of the legion, wings spread in eternal defiance, and beside it the personal standard of the emperor, purple cloth embroidered with gold thread, that probably cost more than most Lusitanians would earn in a lifetime. "Beautiful, aren't they?" a voice said from the doorway. Cale spun to find Tribune Marcellus himself standing there, flanked by a dozen soldiers with weapons drawn. The tribune's face bore a smile that held no humor, only grim satisfaction. "I've been expecting you, Cale Varro," Marcellus said. "Did you really think I wouldn't anticipate an attempt to humiliate Rome? I've been setting this trap for days, just waiting for you to be foolish enough to spring it." Cale's mind raced, calculating angles and odds. The room had 1 door, now blocked, 1 window, too high and narrow for easy escape. 12 armed soldiers against 4 rebels, only 2 of whom, Cale and Ryan, had any real combat training. The mathematics of survival looked impossible, but then they always had. "Ryan, the window," Cale said quietly. "On my signal." "I'm not leaving you." "That's an order," Kyle's voice cracked like a whip. "Someone has to survive to tell the story. Make it count." Then he moved, his gladius appearing in his hand as if conjured from air, driving directly at Marcellus with the kind of aggressive assault that turned defense into chaos. The tribune barely got his own sword up in time to block, stumbling backward into his men. The soldier surged forward, but the doorway was narrow, limiting how many could engage at once. Cale used that bottleneck savagely, his blade finding the gaps between armor plates with the precision of someone who'd made a career of knowing exactly where to strike to kill quickly. A soldier went down clutching his throat. Another fell screaming with Kael's blade in his eye socket. The tribune was shouting orders, but his voice was lost in the chaos of combat in confined space. Behind Kael, Rian and the others were at the window, using their weapons to break the wooden shutters. One of their team took a javelin through the back and crashed to the floor. Another was cut down trying to cover their escape. "Go!" Kael roared, holding the doorway against increasingly desperate attempts to rush him. "Now!" Rian hesitated one heartbeat longer, their eyes meeting across the blood-soaked room. Then he grabbed the Emperor's standard, threw it to one of their fighters who'd already climbed out the window, and followed him into empty air. The 3-story drop should have killed them. Instead, they landed in a hay wagon that Brennus's people had positioned earlier as a backup escape route, rolling out and disappearing into the crowded streets before the garrison could organize pursuit. Kyle heard them escape and felt grim satisfaction even as a Roman blade opened a long cut across his ribs. He couldn't hold the doorway much longer. His arms were growing heavy, blood loss making him slower with each exchange. But he'd bought enough time. The mission was complete. Rome had been humiliated, her precious standards stolen, her invincible garrison violated. Now he just had to survive long enough to see what that victory meant. A shield bash caught him in the chest, sending him staggering backward. He managed to wound the soldier who'd struck him, but others were pouring through the doorway now, overwhelming him with numbers. A pommel strike to his temple made the world spin. His gladius was torn from his grip. Strong hands forced him to his knees, and he felt the cold kiss of steel against his throat. Tribune Marcellus stood before him, his face flushed with fury and exertion. "You cost me 2 men and my emperor's standard, Gladiator. Before this is over, you'll beg me to crucify you just to end the pain." Kael met his eyes and smiled, blood on his teeth. "Your emperor's standard is probably being paraded through every village in Lusitania by now. Every person who sees it will know that Rome can be beaten. That's worth whatever you do to me." Marcellus's fist caught him across the jaw and the world went dark. Kael woke in chains hanging from the wall of a cell deep in the garrison's dungeons. Every part of his body screamed pain. Broken ribs, dislocated shoulder, cuts and bruises that blurred together into one continuous agony. They'd beaten him methodically, professionally, the kind of torture designed to extract information while keeping the victim alive. But Kael had endured worse in the arena. Pain was an old companion, and he knew how to find the quiet space in his mind where it couldn't reach. Days passed in darkness, punctuated by interrogations. Marcellus wanted names, locations, the structure of the resistance. Kael gave him nothing but silence and occasional lies designed to send Roman patrols in useless directions. On what Kael guessed was the 5th day, the cell door opened to admit not Marcellus, but an older officer whose armor bore the insignia of a legate, a commander of multiple legions, answering directly to the provincial governor. The man studied Kael with the clinical interest of someone examining an interesting specimen. Kael Varro called the Shadow of the Sands. 17 victories in the Colosseum, bought your freedom with blood and coin, disappeared from Rome 3 years ago. I saw you fight once, during the Festival of Mars. You killed a Germanic champion in under 3 minutes. It was magnificent. Everything I did in that arena was slavery dressed up as glory, Kael said through split lips. There was nothing magnificent about it. Perhaps. The legate pulled up a stool and sat, showing no fear despite being alone with a man who'd killed dozens. I am Legate Gaius Petronius, commander of the Lusitanian garrison forces. Tribune Marcellus reports that you've been leading a provincial rebellion, killing Roman soldiers, stealing imperial property. Under normal circumstances, I would have you crucified and be done with it. These aren't normal circumstances? These are not. Petronius leaned forward, his weathered face serious. Your rebellion has become a symbol, Varro. The stolen standards have been displayed in 7 villages that we know of, maybe more. Recruitment to your cause has tripled in the past week, and more problematically, my superiors in Rome are beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about why a handful of provincials are making the empire look incompetent. Sounds like a problem for you, not me. It's a problem for everyone, Petronius corrected. Marcellus wants to crucify you and every rebel he can find, burn villages until resistance is crushed completely. It's the traditional approach, and it's effective in the short term. But I've been fighting Rome's wars for 30 years, and I've learned that some enemies can't be defeated with swords alone. Cale studied the older man, trying to understand where this was leading. What are you proposing? A different kind of victory. Petronius stood, pacing the small cell. Marcellus sees you as a criminal to be executed. I see you as a problem to be solved. The truth is, Lusitania has been mismanaged for years. The governor is corrupt. The tax collectors rapacious. The recruitment orders excessive. Your rebellion exists because Rome has been taking too much and giving too little in return. So you're admitting Rome is wrong? I'm admitting that occupying territory requires balancing force with fairness. We've been out of balance here, and you've exploited that brilliantly. Petronius stopped pacing and faced Cale directly. Here's my offer. You call off your rebellion. Your people lay down their arms, return the stolen standards, and accept Roman authority. In exchange, I guarantee a full review of provincial governance. Tax rates will be adjusted, recruitment orders suspended for 5 years, and corrupt officials prosecuted. Your fighters receive amnesty, no executions, no crucifixions, no reprisals. And me? You're too dangerous to release and too valuable to kill. You'll be exiled to the far frontier, somewhere far from Lusitania, where your reputation can't inspire further rebellion. It's not freedom, but it's better than dying on a cross. Cale wanted to laugh at the audacity of it. This legate was offering him everything he'd fought for: justice for Lusitania, safety for his people, in exchange for accepting personal defeat. What makes you think I'd accept? That I'd trade my freedom for promises Rome might not keep? Because you're not an idealist drunk on rebellion, Petronius said. You're a pragmatist who understands the mathematics of survival. You know you can't win a military victory. Best case, you fight a guerrilla campaign for years that gets hundreds of civilians killed before Rome eventually crushes you anyway. Worst case, Marcellus burns the entire province to ashes, making an example. This way, you lose personally, but Lusitania wins. Isn't that worth the sacrifice? The terrible thing was, Petronius was right. Cale had known from the beginning that victory in any conventional sense was impossible. All they could do was make occupation costly enough that Rome chose to govern more fairly. This offer achieved that goal without more bloodshed, but accepting it meant abandoning the people who'd followed him, trusting Rome's word, and consigning himself to exile and obscurity. I need to think about it, Cale said. You have until tomorrow. Petronius moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Vero, I respect what you've built here. You took farmers and merchants and turned them into fighters. You made Rome bleed when everyone said it was impossible. In another life, you would have made an excellent Roman officer. In another life, Cale said quietly, Rome wouldn't have needed officers because she wouldn't be trying to conquer everyone who isn't her. After Petronius left, Cale hung in his chains and thought about the impossible choice before him. He could refuse the offer, maintain his defiance, and watch Rome burn Lusitania to ashes in retaliation. Or he could accept, ensure his people's safety, and spend the rest of his life knowing he'd bought peace with surrender. There was no right answer, only the choice between bad and worse. That night, an explosion rocked the garrison. Flames erupted from the eastern barracks, and alarm bells began ringing across Portus Magnus. Through his cell's high window, Cale could hear shouting, the clash of weapons, the organized chaos of a garrison under attack. His cell door burst open to reveal Ryan, blood-spattered and grinning like a madman. Thought you'd wait around for a rescue, or were you planning to negotiate your way out? How did you... Brennus knew the old smuggling tunnels under the garrison. We've been planning this since you didn't come back. Rian was already working on Cale's chains with a set of lockpicks. The diversion won't last long. We need to move. There are 24 guards between here and the exit. There were. Rian got the chains open and Cale collapsed forward, his legs nearly buckling after days of hanging. Declan's team cleared the way. Can you walk? Can I run? Cale tested his weight, ignored the screaming protest from his ribs. Because walking won't get us out of here. They emerged from the dungeons into controlled chaos. Fire had spread from the barracks to nearby buildings, creating smoke that reduced visibility to yards. Kael's rescue team had done their work well. Dead sentries marked their path, and the garrison's response was focused on the fires rather than the dungeons. They were halfway to the tunnel entrance when Tribune Marcellus appeared with a squad of soldiers, emerging from the smoke like an avenging spirit. "I should have killed you the moment we captured you," Marcellus snarled, his gladius already drawn. "Probably," Kael agreed, accepting a sword from one of his rescuers. "But you Romans always did prefer complicated solutions to simple problems." The fighting was brief and brutal. Kael, despite his injuries, moved with the fluid precision of someone for whom violence was a second language. Marcellus was skilled, but he fought with anger rather than discipline, and anger made you predictable. Kael's blade found the gap between breastplate and shoulder guard, driving deep. Marcellus went down with a cry of pain and rage, and his soldiers faltered. "Go," Kael commanded his team. "I'll hold them." "Not this time," Rian said, and something in his voice made Kael turn. The young man was holding his side, blood seeping between his fingers from a wound Kael hadn't seen him take. His face was pale, but determined. "I'll hold them," Rian said. "You've done enough. Time for someone else to be the hero." "Rian, no. That's an order." Rian smiled, echoing the words Kael had used during their infiltration. "Someone has to survive to lead what we've built. And it can't be the gladiator who Rome will never negotiate with. It has to be someone from Lusitania, someone the people know, someone who can make Petronius's offer mean something." Understanding crashed over Kael. Rian had heard about the offer somehow, had understood its implications, and was making the impossible choice that Kael couldn't. "You'll die here," Kael said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. "Maybe. Maybe I'll surrender and spend years in Roman cells. Either way, I'm done running." Rian pressed something into Kael's hand, the leather bracelet Marin had made, the one Kael had kept all these weeks. "Give this back to her. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise to come home. But tell her it mattered, all of it mattered." Roman soldiers were regrouping, more coming through the smoke. There was no time left for arguments or goodbyes. Kael gripped Rian's shoulder once, trying to convey everything he felt: respect, gratitude, grief, in that single gesture. Then he ran for the tunnel, leaving the young man who'd become his student and friend to face Rome's fury alone. The tunnel led them through darkness and old stone, emerging finally in the civilian quarter outside the garrison walls. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of fighting, the roar of flames, Rian's voice shouting defiance that was suddenly, terribly cut short. Kael forced himself not to look back, to keep moving, to honor Ryan's sacrifice by surviving it. They made it back to the mountain refuge 3 days later, battered and mourning. The news of the rescue and Ryan's last stand had already reached the camp, spreading with the supernatural speed of stories that captured imaginations. Brennus met them at the cave entrance, his scarred face grave. "The Romans are pulling back. Petronius sent word through intermediaries. He's willing to honor the offer he made you, with modifications. Tax reform, end to excessive recruitment, amnesty for fighters. All of it, in exchange for the rebellion standing down." "And Rian?" Kael asked, though he already knew the answer. "Captured alive. Held as a political prisoner, not executed. Petronius is showing restraint, probably to prove his offer is genuine." Kael looked at the assembled fighters. Fewer now, after so much loss, but hardened and determined in ways they hadn't been when this started. These people had learned to resist, had tasted victory against impossible odds, had proven that courage could stand against empire. "Gather everyone," Kael said. "It's time to decide what happens next." The meeting that followed was long and emotional. Some wanted to keep fighting, to honor Rian's sacrifice with continued resistance. Others argued that accepting the offer was what Rian had died to make possible. The debate raged until Sarah stood and spoke with quiet authority. "Rian told me once that courage isn't about winning. It's about standing up even when you know you'll fall. We stood up. We proved Rome isn't invincible. Now we need the courage to accept victory even when it doesn't look like we imagined." In the end, the vote was nearly unanimous. They would accept Petronius's terms, with conditions. the return of the standards in exchange for Rian's release, continued oversight to ensure promises were kept, and safe passage for any fighters who wanted to leave Lusitania rather than live under Roman rule. Kyle negotiated the final terms himself, meeting with Petronius under flag of truce in neutral territory. The legate was true to his word, agreeing to everything except Kyle's freedom. "You're too dangerous to remain here," Petronius said without apology. "You've shown what one determined leader can accomplish. I can't risk you inspiring another rebellion in 10 years when the current reforms become inconvenient. Exile is the best offer you'll receive." "Where?" Kale asked. "The Germanic frontier, brutal, cold, and far from civilization. You'll work as a military advisor training auxiliaries in unconventional warfare. It's important work, and it will keep you too busy to cause trouble." It was banishment disguised as employment, but Kyle had made peace with that. "And the others? True amnesty?" "True amnesty. No reprisals, no secret executions. Your people will be allowed to rebuild their lives." Petronius paused. "You should know, what you did here, it's already spreading. Other provinces are hearing about Lusitanian resistance. Some of my colleagues in Rome are furious, others are quietly impressed. You may have changed more than you realize." The formal exchange happened on neutral ground, witnessed by representatives from a dozen villages. Kyle's fighters returned the stolen standards with dignity rather than defeat, each one stepping forward to place the symbols of Roman authority back into official hands. And in exchange, Rian was released from Roman custody, thin and scarred but alive, walking into the sunlight with the kind of bearing that came from surviving the unsurvivable. The reunion was bittersweet. Rian embraced Kale fiercely, both men knowing this was goodbye. "You're really going?" Rian asked. "Germania is calling," Kyle said with a wry smile. "Apparently I have a talent for teaching farmers to fight empires. Might as well put it to use. We couldn't have done this without you. You would have found another way. You were always the real leader here. I was just the weapon you needed for a while." Kale pressed the leather bracelet into Rian's hand. "Return this to Marin. Tell her I kept it safe, and it brought me luck when I needed it most." "I will." Rian's voice was thick with emotion. "What you taught us, about standing up, about fighting smart, about courage mattering more than victory, we won't forget it." "Make sure you don't," Kyle said, "because Rome has a short memory when it comes to promises. Stay vigilant, stay organized, and the moment they start taking more than was agreed, remind them what happens when Lusitania says no." As Kyle prepared to depart with his Roman escort, he looked back at the gathered crowd one last time. Fighters who'd learned to believe in themselves, families reunited after weeks of separation, village elders already planning how to rebuild what Rome had destroyed. This wasn't the ending he'd imagined when he first stepped into that village square to stop a handful of soldiers from abducting women. He'd thought he was saving strangers and moving on. Instead, he'd helped birth a movement that would echo across generations. The journey to Germania would be long and hard. The frontier would be brutal and unforgiving. But Kyle had survived the arena, had survived leading a rebellion against Rome herself, and he would survive this too. Because survival was what he did. And now, thanks to what they'd built here, an entire province had learned that same lesson. As his horse carried him away from Lusitania toward an uncertain future, Kyle allowed himself one last look back at the mountains where so much blood had been spilled and so much courage had been born. Rian stood at the front of the crowd, one hand raised in farewell, and beside him Kyle could see other faces: Declan, Sarah, Brennus, all the people who'd risked everything for the chance to live free. They were watching their teacher leave, but they weren't afraid anymore. They'd learned the most important lesson Kyle could teach them: that empires weren't invincible, that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things, and that sometimes the greatest victory wasn't defeating your enemy, but refusing to surrender who you were. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, and Kyle rode toward it knowing that whatever happened next, he'd been part of something that mattered. He'd taken frightened farmers and forged them into fighters. He'd shown an entire province that resistance was possible. He'd proven that even against the might of Rome, courage and strategy could carve out moments of triumph. Somewhere in the mountains, in valleys known only to those who'd fought for them,
Families were rebuilding their lives with a freedom they'd earned through blood and sacrifice. Children who'd watched their parents stand up to empire would grow up knowing that submission wasn't inevitable, that dignity was worth fighting for, that the future belonged to those brave enough to shape it. And in the years to come, when Rome pushed too hard and took too much, those children would remember. They would remember the shadow of the sands who'd taught their parents to fight. They would remember Ryan Calder, who'd given everything for their freedom. They would remember that once, impossibly, Lusitania had made Rome blink. That memory would be Kael's true legacy, not the victories or the blood spilled, but the unbreakable knowledge that even the smallest spark of defiance could light fires that empires couldn't extinguish. The road stretched out before him into gathering darkness, and Kael Varro rode toward whatever came next with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd found his purpose in the most unexpected place and fulfilled it beyond all reasonable hope. Behind him, in the land he was leaving forever, the fires of resistance burned on, banked for now, but never truly extinguished. And that was enough. That was everything. The story that had begun with one man stopping an injustice had transformed into something greater than any single person. It had become a testament to the enduring power of courage, the strength found in unity, and the truth that freedom, once tasted, becomes a hunger that no amount of force can permanently satisfy. As the stars emerged overhead and the mountains faded into memory, Kael smiled despite the pain of his wounds and the uncertainty of his exile. He'd walked into Lusitania, a broken gladiator seeking peace. He was leaving as something else entirely, a teacher, a leader, a symbol of resistance that would outlive him by generations. And in the end, that transformation meant more than any arena victory ever could. Because those 17 fights had been about survival. This fight, this impossible, beautiful, tragic rebellion, had been about something worth surviving for. The wind carried whispers from the mountains behind him, voices of those who'd fallen and those who'd endured, all blending into a single message that would echo through Lusitanian history. They had stood. They had fought. They had proven that dignity mattered more than safety, that courage could stand against empire, and that even in the harshest lands under the weight of Rome's iron rule, the human spirit remained unbreakable. And that would have to be enough.